My name is Savannah. I am 33 years old, and 5 years ago my father convinced my fiancé to marry my best friend. He told him she was from the right family, more sophisticated and suitable for a future chief executive officer. I was devastated when I found out, so I moved to Barcelona to build my life. Years later, we reunited at my father's 70th birthday party, and when they saw my husband, their faces went pale, because my husband was the very billionaire my father was begging for a bailout. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in Chicago, my family was obsessed with wealth status and the flawless image of high society perfection. My father, Richard, owned a prestigious private investment firm and treated his children like corporate assets to be managed and traded. I was always the family disappointment. I preferred creativity over climbing his rigid corporate ladder. I wanted to build beautiful boutique hotels, a hospitality dream my father openly mocked at every family dinner. He constantly compared me to my best friend Vanessa, who came from a wealthy country club family and played the role of the perfect compliant socialite. Vanessa knew exactly how to charm my parents, always agreeing with my father's outdated opinions and showering my mother Patricia with empty compliments. 5 years ago, I truly thought I had finally earned my father's elusive approval. I was engaged to Liam, a junior partner at my father's firm. Liam and I had been together for 5 years. I had supported him through his grueling early years at the firm. I brought him dinners at midnight when he was buried in paperwork. I edited his presentations and put my own business plans on hold to focus on planning our perfect life together. Liam always told me I was his rock, the only reason he survived the toxic pressure of my father's company. I believed him completely. It was a crisp Tuesday afternoon when I drove to my father's sprawling estate. I was holding a heavy, beautiful box filled with our freshly printed wedding invitations. They were made of thick cream cardstock with elegant gold foil lettering reading Savannah and Liam. I was so incredibly excited to show them to my father, foolishly hoping that this wedding would finally bridge the painful gap between us and prove that Liam and I were a team. The massive house was quiet when I let myself in. I walked down the long carpeted hallway toward my father's mahogany-paneled home office. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar. I raised my hand to knock, eager to share my joy, but the sound of my own name stopped me cold in my tracks. My father's voice was low, commanding, and laced with the same bitter disdain he had used against me my entire life. Savannah is too focused on her little hospitality dreams, my father was saying. She does not understand corporate legacy, Liam. She wants to open boutique hotels in Europe, not host corporate galas for our top-tier investors. She is a distraction. You are being groomed to take over this firm, and you need a wife who understands the assignment. You need a partner who elevates your standing in this city. I stood completely frozen in the hallway. The heavy box of wedding invitations suddenly felt like a block of lead in my aching arms. I waited for Liam to interrupt. I waited for the man who had proposed to me on bended knee under the stars to defend our 5 years of unwavering love. I waited for him to tell my father that his daughter was worth infinitely more than a corporate merger or a corner office. I held my breath, praying that Liam would prove my father wrong. Instead, my father continued his pitch without any hesitation. Vanessa, on the other hand, comes from the exact right country club pedigree. Her father sits on the board of 3 major banks. She is sophisticated. She knows how to play the social game effortlessly. She is the wife a future chief executive officer needs by his side. If you marry Savannah, you will remain a junior partner forever. If you marry Vanessa, I will personally make you my successor and hand you the keys to the entire empire. The agonizing silence that followed was suffocating. Then I heard the distinct clink of crystal glasses. Liam took a long sip of the expensive scotch my father had poured him. "You are right, Richard," Liam said, his voice completely steady, completely devoid of any remorse or regret. "Vanessa understands the firm's grand vision. Savannah is just too distracted by her pet projects." I cannot afford to have a wife who does not align with my career trajectory. I need someone who understands the sacrifices required for real success. My lungs literally forgot how to pull in air. My best friend, my fiancé, my father. In less than 2 minutes, the three people I trusted most in the entire world had conspired to completely erase my future. The betrayal was so profound, so meticulously calculated that it went far beyond simple heartbreak. It was a hostile takeover of my entire existence. I thought about all the times Vanessa had come over to our apartment for dinner pouring wine and laughing loudly with Liam while I cooked in the kitchen. I thought about the lingering glances between them that I had naively dismissed as paranoia. I thought about my mother constantly telling me I needed to dress more elegantly, like Vanessa, act more refined like Vanessa, be more accommodating like Vanessa. They had been actively grooming her to replace me right in front of my face, and Liam had been a willing participant the entire time. I did not run away crying down the hallway. I did not collapse on the floor in a puddle of tears. A strange freezing calm washed over my entire body. It was the clarity of someone who suddenly realizes they have been living in a house of cards. I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open wide. They creaked loudly, and both men snapped their heads toward the entrance in pure shock. Liam literally choked on his scotch, coughing violently as all the color drained from his handsome face. My father slowly lowered his crystal glass, his expression instantly hardening into a mask of cold authority. I walked directly into the center of the lavish room. I lifted the expensive box of wedding invitations and slammed it onto the pristine mahogany desk. The heavy thud echoed through the silent office, causing the crystal decanter to rattle violently against the wood. So I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air like absolute ice. Should we call the printer and ask for a full refund, or do you just want to cross out my name and write Vanessa's on top with a marker to save some money? Liam stumbled backward, wiping his mouth with the back of his trembling hand. Savannah, please wait. How long have you been standing there? Let me explain. This is not what it sounds like. We were just talking about hypotheticals. It sounds exactly like a business transaction, I replied, staring a hole right through his cowardly soul. I just did not realize my 5 years of love and loyalty was a depreciating asset you could trade for a quick promotion. My father stepped around the desk, completely unbothered by the absolute devastation he had just orchestrated. He looked at me with cold, calculating eyes entirely devoid of any paternal warmth. Do not be so overly emotional, Savannah. This is exactly why you are not fit for the corporate world. You let your fragile feelings cloud practical judgment. Liam has immense potential, and he needs a partner who can elevate his status in this city. You have always been determined to play hotel manager and ignore your real duties to this family. It is just business. Try to look at the bigger picture. Just business, I repeated, the words tasting like poison on my tongue. You are selling my fiancé to my best friend, and you call it business. Vanessa is a much better fit, my father stated flatly, crossing his arms over his chest. Her family brings financial connections we desperately need. Your mother and I have already discussed it with her parents behind your back. They are thrilled. Vanessa is thrilled. Liam is making the smart, logical choice for his future. You need to accept reality and stop throwing a childish tantrum. I turned my intense gaze back to Liam, the man I had loved so deeply, the man I had planned to build a beautiful family with, could not even look me in the eye. He stared at the intricate patterns of the Persian rug, clutching his Scotch glass like a lifeline. He had sold me out for a corner office and a fancy title, discarding me without a second thought. Here is your new reality. My father continued, his voice taking on a dark, threatening edge. You are going to accept this gracefully. You will stay in Chicago. I will give you a quiet, low-level administrative job in the marketing department where you can stay out of the way. You will attend the firm's social events, and you will smile for the cameras. If you try to cause a scene or embarrass this family in any way, I will cut you off completely. You will lose everything. You will be nothing without this family's money backing you up. The sheer audacity of his cruel ultimatum crystallized my resolve. They truly thought I was weak. They thought I was a pathetic scapegoat who would just bow my head, take the miserable scraps they offered, and silently watch my best friend marry the man I loved. They thought their vast wealth owned my soul and dictated my worth. I reached for my left hand. I slowly slid the 2-carat diamond engagement ring off my finger. The beautiful stone caught the light of the desk lamp, sparkling with the false promise of a future that had never really existed. I walked over to Liam, who was visibly trembling now under my unwavering stare. "You want to be the chief executive officer?" I said quietly, holding the diamond ring between my thumb and forefinger directly over his drink. "Then you are going to have to learn how to swallow a lot of garbage." I dropped the heavy diamond ring directly into his glass of scotch. It sank to the bottom with a quiet sound, completely submerged in the amber liquid. Liam stared at the glass in pure horror, unable to speak. My father's face turned purple with rage at my blatant defiance. "If you walk out that door, Savannah, you are dead to this family." My father bellowed, his angry voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "You will never make it out there on your own. Your little hospitality dreams will fail miserably, and you will come crawling back here begging on your knees for my financial help." I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear for them to enjoy. I just looked at the two men who had completely underestimated my worth and smiled a genuine, chilling smile. "Enjoy your business deal," I said. I turned around and walked out of the office, the heavy mahogany doors clicking shut behind me. I walked away from their toxic control, entirely unaware of the massive global empire I was about to build, and the devastating public reckoning I would bring back to them exactly 5 years later. I marched up the grand, sweeping staircase of my childhood home, my footsteps muffled by the thick designer runners my mother had imported from Turkey. My mind was moving 1,000,000 miles a minute, calculating my next moves with a cold precision I never knew I possessed. I grabbed a duffel bag from the back of my closet and started throwing my essentials inside. A few tailored suits, some comfortable shoes, and the business blueprints I had spent the last 2 years drafting in secret. As I zipped the bag shut, a shadow fell across the doorway. My mother Patricia stood there holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. She was wearing her signature pearl necklace and an expression of mild inconvenience, as if my shattered engagement was nothing more than a spilled drink on her pristine white carpets. "Savannah, please tell me you are not throwing a tantrum." My mother sighed, taking a delicate sip from her glass. "Your father just texted me that you stormed out of his office. You really need to learn how to handle adult conversations without resorting to theatrics." I hoisted the heavy bag onto my shoulder and walked toward her. "A tantrum," I repeated, staring at the woman who was supposed to be my protector. "My father just sold my fiancé to my best friend to secure a corporate merger, and you call my reaction a tantrum?" Patricia waved her manicured hand, completely unbothered by the absolute destruction of my future. "You are being horribly dramatic. Liam is an ambitious young man. He needs a wife who can navigate the complex social circles of Chicago's elite. Vanessa has the right background. Her parents are dear friends of ours. It makes perfect sense for everyone involved. You should be happy for them instead of acting so bitter." The sheer delusion in her voice was breathtaking. She genuinely believed that sacrificing her own daughter on the altar of high society was a reasonable business strategy. I stepped closer to her, the realization settling over me like a heavy winter coat. "You knew," I said softly. "You knew they were planning this behind my back." "Of course we knew," Patricia replied, not even attempting to hide her complicity. "We encouraged it. In fact, Vanessa is coming over later this evening to celebrate the new arrangement. Speaking of which, since you are clearly leaving to pout, I am going to need you to leave your spare house key on the console table." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline of a sick joke. "You want my key? You?" "Yes," Patricia said impatiently. "Vanessa is going to need the guest room for a few weeks while she and Liam look for a suitable house in the suburbs. We cannot have you barging in unannounced and making things uncomfortable for them. They have a lot of planning to do." There it was, the final, undeniable proof that my entire family valued social status and wealth over my very existence. I was not a daughter to them. I was an obstacle to be cleared away, an inconvenience, taking up space that could be given to someone with a better pedigree. I reached into my purse, pulled out the heavy brass key I had carried since I was 16, and dropped it into her empty hand. The metal clinked sharply against her diamond rings. "You are absolutely right, Mother," I said, my voice steady and devoid of any emotion. "You do not have to worry about me barging in unannounced ever again." I walked past her down the sweeping staircase and out the heavy oak front doors. I did not look back. I did not wait for an apology that was never going to come. I got into my car and drove straight to the international airport. Sitting in the terminal with nothing but my personal savings account and a duffel bag, I pulled up an airline website on my phone. My father had always mocked my dream of opening a luxury boutique hotel in Europe. He called it a foolish fantasy for people who lacked real business acumen. So I booked a one-way ticket to Barcelona on the very next flight. The next 5 years were a grueling, relentless grind. I arrived in Spain knowing absolutely nobody, but I carried a burning determination that fueled my every waking moment. I rented a tiny, unheated apartment above a noisy market. I spent my days pitching my hospitality blueprints to independent investors, facing countless rejections and working nights as an event coordinator just to keep a roof over my head. Through it all, I never asked my parents for a single dime. I changed my phone number and completely vanished from the social circles of Chicago. I let them believe whatever narrative they had spun to cover up their toxic betrayal. Slowly, my relentless hustle paid off. I secured funding from a group of visionary European investors who saw the absolute genius in my business model. I opened my first boutique hotel in a historic district of Barcelona. It was an overnight sensation, praised for its unique blend of local culture and high-end luxury. Within 2 years, I opened a second location in Madrid, then a third in Rome. My small hospitality dream exploded into a massive multi-million-dollar European hotel empire. I was no longer the scapegoat of the Chicago elite. I was a powerhouse chief executive officer in my own right, negotiating international property acquisitions and building a fortune that rivaled my father's entire investment firm. During those 5 years of building my empire, I met a man who completely rewrote my understanding of partnership. Dominic was not intimidated by my ambition. He celebrated it. He was a brilliant self-made entrepreneur who matched my drive step for step. He was the chief executive officer of a massive European conglomerate, yet he always made sure I knew I was his absolute priority. When we married 3 years ago in a private ceremony overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, I did not invite my family. I did not even tell them I was engaged. I kept my beautiful, authentic life completely separate from the toxic wasteland I had left behind. Then, on a rainy Tuesday morning, 5 years after my cold departure, the past finally came knocking at my door. I was sitting at the massive glass desk in my penthouse office in Barcelona, reviewing the quarterly profit reports for my newest hotel in Paris. My executive assistant walked in and handed me a thick gold-embossed envelope that had been forwarded through my old business contacts. I sliced the envelope open with a silver letter opener. Inside was an invitation printed on heavy, ridiculously expensive cardstock. It was an invitation to my father Richard's 70th birthday gala, set to take place at the most exclusive country club in Chicago. They were apparently pulling out all the stops to project an image of absolute financial triumph. But it was not the extravagant invitation that caught my attention. It was the bright yellow sticky note attached to the back, written in my mother's unmistakable, elegant cursive handwriting. I peeled the note off and read the words. "Savannah," the note began, "we assume you will want to make an appearance. However, there is a strict policy of no +1s unless you are legally married. We do not want your temporary flings ruining the formal family photographs. Please dress appropriately and try not to draw attention to yourself." I sat back in my leather executive chair and let out a genuine, joyful laugh. The sheer audacity was almost impressive. After 5 years of absolute silence, they still viewed me as the pathetic, lonely failure who needed to be managed and hidden away in the background. They genuinely believed I was still scraping by, struggling to find my place in a world they thought they completely controlled. They had no idea that the small hospitality dream they had so viciously mocked was now generating more annual revenue than my father's entire firm. They had no idea that I had spent the last 5 years becoming completely untouchable. I looked down at my left hand. The spectacular, flawless diamond ring Dominic had designed for me caught the morning sunlight pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. It sparkled with the weight of a true, unshakable partnership. My mother did not want any temporary flings ruining their precious family photos. She demanded I only bring a legal husband to their grand high society event. I smiled, picking up my phone to dial my assistant. "Clear my schedule for next weekend," I instructed, "and book 2 first-class tickets to Chicago. My husband and I have a birthday party to attend." The tires of the black town car crunched softly against the pristine gravel of the elite Chicago Country Club. I stepped out into the crisp evening air, leaving my husband in the car to handle an urgent overseas conference call. He promised to join me inside the moment he finished. I smoothed the fabric of my custom designer gown. It was a masterpiece of understated elegance, crafted from midnight blue silk that clung to my frame perfectly. I wore no flashy jewelry, only the glittering diamond on my left hand. I did not need to scream for attention. True power never has to raise its voice. I walked through the heavy oak double doors and handed my coat to a stunned attendant. The grand ballroom was a sea of glittering chandeliers, towering floral arrangements, and the wealthiest socialites in Chicago. A string quartet played softly in the corner. The moment my heels clicked against the marble floor of the entrance, a ripple of whispers began to spread through the crowd. Heads turned, eyes widened, champagne flutes paused halfway to lips. They all remembered the scandal from 5 years ago. They all thought I was the disgraced, heartbroken daughter who fled to Europe with nothing. Before I could even take a full breath of the expensive floral-scented air, my mother intercepted me. Patricia materialized from the crowd like a heat-seeking missile. She wore an overly beaded silver gown that looked heavy and desperate. Her face was a rigid mask of sheer panic and fury. "What on earth are you doing here?" she hissed, grabbing my upper arm with a grip that would have left bruises if I had not smoothly twisted away from her grasp. "I received an invitation, Mother," I replied, my voice completely level and calm. "It is my father's 70th birthday. I came to celebrate his legacy." My mother's eyes darted frantically around the room, taking in the staring guests. "You have absolutely no right to show up here and cause a scene. Look at you. You did not even bring a date. I explicitly told you in my note that we wanted no embarrassments tonight. We are hosting the most important financial players in the city. You need to stay out of sight." She gestured wildly toward a small, poorly decorated table shoved into a dark alcove right next to the swinging doors of the kitchen. "That is your seat," she commanded. "Go sit down before Vanessa and Liam see you. Do not speak to anyone. Do not eat the caviar. Just stay hidden." I looked at the miserable little table, then looked back at the woman who had birthed me. 5 years ago, her words would have crushed my spirit. Today, they sounded like the frantic buzzing of a trapped insect. "I am not sitting by the kitchen, Mother," I stated clearly. "I am going to sit wherever I please, and you might want to adjust your posture. You look panicked, and it is terribly unflattering in this lighting." Patricia gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Before she could launch another toxic demand, a loud, grating voice pierced the elegant atmosphere. "Savannah, I cannot believe you actually showed up." I turned to see Vanessa pushing her way through the crowd. My former best friend was a walking display of aggressive insecurity. She wore a bright crimson gown that screamed for attention, and she was absolutely dripping in diamonds. A diamond choker, diamond tennis bracelet stacked up to her elbow, and diamond drop earrings that swung wildly as she marched toward me. She had a tight grip on a crystal champagne flute. Vanessa stopped right in front of me, flashing a perfectly manicured, entirely fake smile of deep pity. She looked me up and down, clearly trying to find a flaw in my understated silk gown, but finding nothing to criticize. "You are so brave to come back here," Vanessa said loudly, ensuring the surrounding tables could hear every single word. "Everyone told me you were still struggling in Spain." I told Liam we should have sent you a check to help you get on your feet, but you know how busy we are. We just closed on a brand new massive estate in the northern suburbs. It has 10 bedrooms. I smiled gently, taking a delicate flute of champagne from a passing waiter. 10 bedrooms, I replied. That sounds like a lot of empty space to fill. Vanessa stiffened her fake smile, faltering for a fraction of a second. Well, we need the space. She countered quickly, puffing out her chest. Liam is doing incredibly well. He is basically running your father's firm now. He just bought me the brand new luxury sport utility vehicle parked out front, the customized one with the white leather interior. Our marriage is just absolute perfection. We are the ultimate power couple of Chicago. It is a shame you never found anyone to settle down with, Savannah. But I suppose a woman without a clear future is a hard sell for a successful man. My mother nodded in vigorous agreement, standing shoulder to shoulder with the woman who had stolen my fiancé. Vanessa is right, Savannah. You should be taking notes on how a proper society wife behaves. I took a slow sip of my champagne, letting the crisp bubbles wash over my tongue. I did not break eye contact with Vanessa. I let the silence stretch between us. I let her feel the total absence of my jealousy. My utter lack of reaction was a mirror reflecting her own deep insecurities, and I could see it driving her absolutely insane. She needed me to cry. She needed me to act bitter. She desperately needed me to validate her stolen life. When my silence became too heavy for her to bear, Vanessa decided to go for the ultimate kill. She reached up with her left hand to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear, making a grand, sweeping gesture. The ballroom lights caught the massive piece of jewelry on her index finger, sending brilliant green flashes across the room. It was the emerald. My breath caught in my throat for just a second, but I locked my expression into stone. It was the legendary vintage emerald ring, the centerpiece of my family's heritage. Since I was a little girl, my father had promised me that ring. He told me it belonged to the true heir of the family, a symbol of our legacy. I had spent hours staring at it in the family safe, dreaming of the day I would be worthy enough to wear it. "Do you like it?" Vanessa asked, her voice dripping with venomous triumph. She held her hand out right in front of my face, wiggling her fingers so the emerald caught the chandelier light. Richard gifted it to me for my anniversary with Liam. He told me he wanted the ring to belong to the true daughter of the firm. The daughter who actually stayed and honored the family name. My mother stepped closer, her eyes gleaming with malicious satisfaction. It looks absolutely stunning on Vanessa. It suits a woman of her high caliber, much better than it ever would have suited a runaway. The surrounding guests leaned in, their conversations dying down completely. The elite socialites of Chicago waited for my inevitable breakdown. They waited for me to burst into tears, to scream, to finally show the devastation of a woman who had lost her inheritance, her best friend, and her fiancé in one fell swoop. Instead of crying, I stepped directly into Vanessa's personal space. I reached out and gently took her wrist. I held her hand up between us, pulling the magnificent emerald closer to my eyes. Vanessa froze, her triumphant smile replaced by a look of sudden sharp confusion. I inspected the heavy gold setting. I looked at the deep green stone. I felt the familiar weight of the history it carried. Then I smiled. "It is a beautiful piece, Vanessa," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the hushed crowd. "But you really should have a professional jeweler look at the left prong." Vanessa tried to pull her hand back, but I held it firmly in place. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice pitching an octave higher. "It is a flawless vintage piece." Richard said it was flawless. I pointed my manicured fingernail at the very edge of the emerald, right where the gold claw gripped the stone. "It is not flawless," I corrected calmly, loud enough for the society matrons at the next table to hear. "There is a microscopic carbon inclusion right beneath this left prong. The original setting was damaged during a gala in 1920 by my great-grandmother. The gold was recast, but the inclusion remains. It is a tiny hidden fracture inside the stone. It weakens the entire structure of the gem. You can only see it if you are the true owner of the ring, if you know exactly where the broken pieces are hidden." I released her wrist and let her hand drop. "It is a beautiful imitation of perfection. I continued wiping my hand on a silk cocktail napkin as if touching her had soiled my skin. But at its core, it is fundamentally flawed and incredibly fragile, much like the marriage it represents. Enjoy the ring, Vanessa. It suits you perfectly. Vanessa's mouth opened and closed in rapid succession. She looked down at the massive emerald, her face draining of all color. The triumph in her eyes vanished, replaced by an agonizing wave of public humiliation. She tugged nervously at the diamond choker around her neck, suddenly looking incredibly small and foolish in her loud crimson gown. The guests around us began to whisper again, but this time the hushed voices were entirely focused on Vanessa's visible panic. My mother's jaw dropped. She stepped forward to defend her precious daughter-in-law, her face contorting with fresh rage. "Savannah, how dare you insult?" Before Patricia could finish her sentence, a heavy, arrogant voice boomed over the string quartet, cutting through the tension like a dull knife. "Is there a problem here, ladies? I certainly hope no one is causing a scene on my big night." I turned slowly, bracing myself for the next wave of the assault. Standing there holding a crystal glass of expensive scotch and wearing a tailored tuxedo was Liam, the golden boy of the firm, the man who traded our future for a promotion, and he was glaring directly at me. How do you envision Savannah handling Liam's initial confrontation in the next section? The grand ballroom was suffocatingly silent, every single pair of eyes locked onto me. The city's most elite figures waited with bated breath to see how the prodigal daughter would handle this spectacular public humiliation. Richard stood on the stage, the silver microphone gripped tightly in his hand, a smug, self-satisfied grin plastered across his face. He truly believed he had me cornered. He thought his grand gesture of false charity would force me to bow my head, shuffle forward, and accept my designated place at the very bottom of his empire. Beside me, Liam let out a quiet snort of amusement. Vanessa adjusted her posture, looking down her nose at me with renewed confidence. They were all waiting for my surrender. I did not lower my gaze. I did not shift my weight or show a single ounce of embarrassment. Instead, I offered my father a polite, radiant smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I raised my voice just enough to carry through the hushed room, ensuring my tone was light conversational and entirely unbothered. "Thank you for the incredibly generous offer, Richard," I said, clearly dropping the title of father entirely. "It is so comforting to know you are still looking out for entry-level applicants. However, my schedule is rather full these days. I'm afraid my little overseas adventure has evolved into something a bit too demanding to allow for administrative filing. But I do appreciate the thought. Perhaps you should offer the position to someone who actually needs the experience." A quiet murmur rippled through the crowd. My father's smile stiffened, his grip on the microphone tightening until his knuckles turned white. He had expected gratitude or tears. He certainly had not expected a graceful, completely unruffled decline. To counter his meticulously crafted narrative that I was a broke, struggling runaway desperate for a handout, I smoothly turned my attention away from the stage. I caught the eye of the head sommelier, who had been hovering near the edge of the crowd, watching the drama unfold with wide eyes. I raised 2 fingers in a subtle, elegant gesture. The sommelier, trained to recognize the subtle commands of true wealth, immediately rushed over to my side carrying a silver tray. "Good evening," I said, addressing the sommelier with a warm, respectful tone that sharply contrasted with the coldness of my family. "I believe this celebration calls for something truly exceptional. Do you happen to have the 1990 Chateau Margaux in your cellar tonight?" The sommelier blinked momentarily, taken aback by the request. The 1990 Chateau Margaux was a legendary vintage renowned across the globe and carried a price tag of exactly $15,000 a bottle. It was not a wine one ordered casually, especially not a woman who had just been publicly offered a minimum wage filing job. "Yes, madam," the sommelier stammered, quickly regaining his professional composure. "We do have 1 bottle remaining in the private reserve." "Excellent," I replied smoothly. "Please bring it to our table and ensure it is properly decanted." I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a solid, matte black titanium card. It was incredibly heavy, completely devoid of any bank logos or spending limits, a card issued only by invitation to clients whose net worth exceeded 9 figures. I dropped the heavy titanium card onto the sommelier's silver tray. It landed with a sharp, heavy clack that seemed to echo through the entire ballroom. "Put the bottle on this," I instructed politely. "And please ensure the staff receives a generous 20% gratuity for the evening." The sommelier stared at the black titanium card, his eyes widening in pure shock. He recognized exactly what it was. "Very good, madam." He bowed deeply, reverence completely replacing his earlier confusion. "Right away." As the sommelier rushed off to retrieve the $15,000 bottle of wine, the silence in our immediate vicinity shattered. The guests standing at the adjacent tables began whispering furiously, their eyes darting between me, the retreating sommelier, and the heavy black card that had just made a profound statement. My mother, Patricia, pushed her way through the small crowd, her beaded silver gown rustling aggressively. Her face was flushed with indignation. She could not comprehend how the daughter she had written off as a complete failure could casually drop $15,000 on a single bottle of wine. Her reality was fracturing, and her immediate defense mechanism was loud, aggressive denial. "Savannah, what on earth do you think you are doing?" Patricia hissed loudly, making absolutely no effort to lower her voice. "Are you completely out of your mind? Do you honestly expect us to believe you can afford that?" I turned to face her, keeping my expression perfectly serene. "I am simply ordering wine for the table, Patricia. It is a celebration after all." "You are putting on a ridiculous show," my mother scoffed loudly, ensuring the nearby socialites heard her narrative. "You always had a flair for the dramatic, Savannah, but this is a new low. You are probably drowning in credit card debt just to keep up appearances. Dropping a black piece of plastic on a tray does not make you wealthy. We all know you are running cheap hostels in Spain. You are going to bankrupt yourself trying to pretend you belong in this room. You are going to be paying off that bottle of wine for the next 10 years. Liam, eager to jump back into the fray and align himself with Patricia's frantic denial, sneered at me. "Your mother is right, Savannah. Financial irresponsibility is exactly why you could never handle the pressure of the firm. You come back here and max out whatever little lines of credit you have left just to spite us. It is incredibly pathetic. You are trying to play a game you cannot afford to lose." Vanessa nodded vigorously, clinging to Liam's arm. "It is just sad," she added, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Real wealth is about sustainable assets, Savannah, not flashing credit cards to impress strangers at a party. You really need to listen to your father and take that administrative job. You are clearly spiraling." I let their insults wash over me like water off a stone. They were so predictable, so desperately clinging to the hierarchy they had established 5 years ago. I ignored Patricia, Liam, and Vanessa entirely. I smoothly pivoted my body back toward the stage where my father had just stepped down, handing the microphone to an event coordinator. Richard was marching toward our group, his face a thundercloud of absolute fury. He hated being dismissed, and he hated losing control of the narrative. "You think you can come into my event and make a mockery of my generosity?" Richard growled as he approached, his voice low and threatening. "You think flashing a fake credit card changes the fact that you are a failure? You are nothing, Savannah." I looked my father directly in his cold, calculating eyes. I did not blink. I did not waver. I leaned in, slightly lowering my voice so that only he, Patricia, and Liam could hear the devastating words I was about to deliver. "I do not need your generosity, Richard," I said, my tone as sharp and precise as a scalpel. "And I certainly do not need a position at a firm that is currently bleeding capital at an unprecedented rate." My father stopped dead in his tracks. His jaw clamped shut. "It is truly fascinating to watch you stand on that stage and boast about your unparalleled success," I continued, my voice silky and lethal. "Especially considering your firm's third-quarter revenues just plunged by 32%. The air around us seemed to instantly freeze. The smug, arrogant masks melted off their faces. The metric I had just casually dropped was highly classified. It was a closely guarded internal secret, a devastating financial reality that Richard and Liam had been desperately hiding from their investors, their board of directors, and the entire Chicago financial community. It was the exact reason they were praying for the European acquisition to save them from total ruin. I watched with immense satisfaction as the color rapidly drained from Liam's handsome face. He looked as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of his lungs. He exchanged a panicked, terrified glance with my father. "Your liquidity ratios are a complete disaster," I added smoothly, twisting the knife with absolute precision. "Your commercial real estate portfolio is currently over-leveraged by nearly $40 million. You are standing in this room projecting absolute invincibility, Richard, while your entire empire is teetering on the absolute edge of bankruptcy. You are one failed acquisition away from total collapse." Patricia gasped, grabbing onto Richard's arm for support. She had no idea how deep the financial trouble ran, but she could see the genuine terror flashing in her husband's eyes. Vanessa looked completely lost, staring at Liam and waiting for him to confidently deny my claims, but Liam was paralyzed with fear. My father's face turned a sickly shade of pale, a stark contrast to his earlier confident flush. The veins in his neck bulged as he struggled to maintain his composure in front of the surrounding guests, who were watching our intense, hushed interaction. His eyes darted around the room, terrified that someone might have overheard the devastating numbers I had just recited. He stepped closer to me, his voice trembling with a mixture of absolute rage and genuine fear. He leaned in, his breath hitting my face as he demanded answers. "How do you know that?" Richard hissed, his voice dropping to a frantic, desperate whisper. "Those numbers are strictly confidential. They are locked down. How do you possess our internal financial data? Who have you been talking to?" Just then, the sommelier returned gracefully, presenting the $15,000 bottle of vintage Chateau Margaux and pouring a perfect measure into my crystal glass. I picked up the delicate stemware, holding the rich red wine up to the light of the chandelier. I took a slow, appreciative sip, letting the complex flavors settle on my palate while my father stared at me with wide, panicked eyes. I lowered the glass and offered him a chilling, razor-sharp smile. "I hear things," I replied quietly. "Let me know if there are any specific elements you want emphasized as we move into Liam's desperate attempt to regain control in the next section." Richard's face transformed into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. The blood drained from his cheeks so rapidly that his skin took on the color of old parchment. He gripped the edge of the silver tray stand, his knuckles turning stark white as he stared at me. He looked like a man who had just realized the solid ground beneath his feet was actually thin ice, and it was cracking loudly under his weight. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand how I knew his most guarded corporate secrets, but no words came out. His chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. Seeing his mentor and future father-in-law completely paralyzed by my words, Liam decided to step in. He pushed his way past my trembling mother and positioned himself directly in front of me, throwing his shoulders back and puffing out his chest in a pathetic display of manufactured alpha male dominance. He let out a loud, booming laugh that sounded entirely hollow and forced. It was the laugh of a desperate man trying to convince a room full of sharks that he was not bleeding. "Do not let her get in your head," Richard Liam said, clapping a heavy hand onto my father's rigid shoulder. "Savannah is just repeating some baseless country club gossip she probably overheard while pouring coffee for her boss in Spain. She has absolutely no idea how real corporate finance works. She is just trying to cause drama because she is bitter. We all know her career is a massive joke." I took another slow, deliberate sip of the 1990 Chateau Margaux. The wine was spectacular, rich and complex, tasting like victory. I lowered my crystal glass and looked at Liam with mild, detached amusement. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush my words. I simply let him hang himself with his own oversized ego. "Is that what you tell yourself, Liam?" I asked smoothly. "That my accurate recitation of your plunging revenue is just idle gossip? That must make it much easier for you to sleep at night." Liam sneered, adjusting the lapels of his expensive but slightly ill-fitting tuxedo. "You can throw around whatever fake numbers you want, Savannah, but it will not matter in exactly 1 hour. My career is about to peak, and this firm is about to become completely untouchable. We are not just surviving, we are expanding globally." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, gloating register designed to make me feel small and insignificant. He wanted to crush my spirit with his impending triumph. "We are finalizing a massive acquisition tonight," Liam bragged, his eyes gleaming with greedy anticipation. "A European conglomerate is buying out a major stake in our firm, Ethelgard Holdings. I am sure you have never heard of them since you are busy running your little Spanish motels, but they are a multi-billion-dollar empire, and I am the one who secured the deal. I brought them to the table. I am the savior of this family." It took every ounce of self-control I possessed not to burst into hysterical laughter right there in the middle of the ballroom. Ethelgard Holdings, my husband's company, the massive conglomerate where I served as the co-founder and majority shareholder of their most profitable hospitality division. Liam was standing in front of me, aggressively boasting about securing a deal with my own company, completely unaware that he was staring into the eyes of the predator who held his entire future in her hands. I tilted my head, feigning polite curiosity. "Ethelgard Holdings," I repeated, keeping my voice perfectly neutral. "That sounds incredibly impressive, Liam. But dealing with European conglomerates can be quite tricky. Are you working with a junior acquisitions team? Sometimes they send low-level analysts to handle struggling firms." Liam scoffed loudly, deeply offended by the very suggestion. "Absolutely not. I do not deal with junior analysts. I am meeting with the chief executive officer himself. We have a close professional rapport. We have been emailing back and forth for the past 6 months regarding the internal audits. He respects my financial modeling. He trusts my vision for the future of this firm. He is flying in tonight specifically to shake my hand and sign the paperwork." I smiled gently, my eyes dropping to my designer clutch resting on the table. "That is fascinating," I murmured. "I am sure your financial modeling was very creative." Under the cover of the heavy velvet tablecloth, I smoothly unclasped my purse and pulled out my phone. I opened my message thread with Dominic. My fingers flew across the screen with practiced speed. "They are waiting for you, darling," I typed. "Try not to laugh when you see them." The message delivered instantly. A moment later, 3 gray dots appeared on the screen, followed by a quick reply from my husband. "I make absolutely no promises, my beautiful wife." I slipped the phone back into my clutch, just as the grand event coordinator stepped up to the microphone on the stage. A soft chime echoed through the ballroom, signaling that the first course was ready to be served. The coordinator politely requested that all guests locate their assigned tables and take their seats for the formal dinner. Patricia immediately grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging into my silk sleeve. "You are not sitting with us," she hissed venomously. "Go find a seat at the back. I will not have you ruining this dinner with your toxic jealousy." I gently but firmly peeled her fingers off my arm, giving her a look so cold it made her physically recoil. Several prominent investors from neighboring tables had paused and were openly staring at our interaction. Richard, ever the slave to public perception, realized that banishing his own daughter to the kitchen doors in front of the city's elite would cause far more damaging gossip than simply letting me sit down. "Let her sit," Patricia Richard ordered through gritted teeth, his face still pale from my earlier financial revelation. "If she wants to watch Liam's triumph up close, let her watch. It will be a good lesson for her to see what real success looks like." I smiled gracefully and glided over to the main table, taking a seat directly across from Liam and my father. Vanessa quickly slid into the chair next to Liam, pulling her hands into her lap to hide the flawed emerald ring she had been so proudly flaunting just moments ago. She glared at me from across the centerpiece, her eyes filled with nervous hostility. The waitstaff moved seamlessly through the room, placing delicate bowls of rich lobster bisque in front of each guest. The clinking of silver spoons against porcelain filled the air. Richard stood up, tapping his crystal wineglass with a knife to command the room's attention. He cleared his throat, forcing his usual pompous arrogance back into his posture. Friends, colleagues, and esteemed partners, Richard began projecting his voice across the ballroom. "Tonight, as we celebrate my 70th birthday, we also celebrate the legacy and the future of this firm. I want to raise a glass to the son I never had, the man who has tirelessly navigated the complex waters of international finance to secure our future. Liam, your dedication is unparalleled. You are the rightful heir to this empire. He completely ignored my existence, deliberately snubbing me in front of hundreds of people. He then turned his praise to Vanessa, and to Vanessa, the perfect supportive wife whose grace and elegance bring honor to our family name. We are thrilled to officially welcome you into our inner circle. The room erupted in polite applause. Liam beamed with arrogant pride, raising his glass in a silent toast to his mentor. Patricia looked over at me with a smug, vindictive smile, expecting me to shrink under the weight of my father's public rejection. As the applause died down and the guests began to eat their bisque, I casually picked up my spoon. I locked eyes with Liam across the table. "So, Liam," I said, my voice carrying clearly over the low hum of conversation, "since we are celebrating your brilliant corporate strategy, I am terribly curious about the Ethelgard acquisition. When you submitted the firm's valuation models to their internal audit team, how exactly did you account for the $30 million deficit in the commercial real estate sector? Did you use a standard EBITDA multiplier, or did you employ something a bit more creative to hide the bleeding?" The air at our table instantly vaporized. Liam froze his spoon, stopping inches from his mouth. A bead of cold sweat formed on his forehead. "I beg your pardon?" Liam stammered, his confident facade cracking violently. "Those numbers are highly confidential, and you clearly do not understand the complex metrics we use for forward-looking projections. There is no deficit. We are perfectly leveraged." I did not let him escape into vague corporate buzzwords. I leaned forward, resting my elbows gracefully on the table, speaking with the lethal surgical precision of a true financial predator. "Perfectly leveraged," I repeated, raising one perfectly arched eyebrow. "That is a fascinating term for defaulting on 3 major construction loans in the past quarter. Ethelgard Holdings requires a strict debt-to-equity ratio of less than 2.5 for any international acquisition. If you submitted the genuine financial records, your ratio would sit closer to 4.8. So, Liam, I have to ask, did you submit the real numbers, or did you cook the books to make the firm look profitable to the European auditors?" The silence that fell over our table was absolute. The wealthy investors seated to my left and right slowly put down their spoons. They turned their heads, staring at Liam with sudden, sharp suspicion. These were men and women who had invested millions in my father's firm. They were not stupid. They recognized the deadly accuracy of my vocabulary and the highly specific, damning nature of my questions. Liam was visibly shaking now. He looked frantically at Richard, silently begging his mentor to save him from this brutal public dissection. But Richard was entirely paralyzed, his eyes wide with horror, as he realized I knew every single dirty secret they had buried in their ledgers. Patricia slammed her silver spoon down against the table with a loud, aggressive clatter. "Stop it this instant, Savannah," she hissed, her face contorting with panic and fury. "You are embarrassing yourself. You are just a jealous college dropout trying to ruin Liam's night because you have absolutely nothing going for you. You do not understand high finance. You are just throwing around big words to get attention. Everyone here knows you are a total failure. Just shut your mouth and eat your soup." I sat back in my chair, unbothered by her frantic shrieking. I took another serene sip of my expensive wine, watching the panic set in across their faces. They were crumbling, fighting desperately to maintain the illusion of their grand empire, while I dismantled it brick by brick. Suddenly, the low hum of conversation in the grand ballroom died down completely. The atmosphere shifted, a heavy, anticipatory hush falling over the crowd. The massive, ornate double doors at the entrance of the dining hall began to swing open. The head maitre d' stepped forward, his posture rigid with deep respect. He cleared his throat, preparing to announce the arrival of the billionaire savior my family had been desperately waiting for. The man who held their entire future in his hands. I smiled into my wine glass. The real show was about to begin. Liam took a long, slow sip of his scotch, the ice clinking loudly against the crystal glass. He stepped into the small circle of tension that had formed around Vanessa, Patricia, and myself. He positioned himself slightly in front of his wife in a protective stance that felt entirely performative. His tuxedo was undoubtedly expensive, tailored to emphasize his broad shoulders, But the arrogant set of his jaw completely ruined the sophisticated image he was trying so desperately to project. He looked at me as if I were a piece of dirt someone had carelessly tracked onto the club's pristine marble floors. Savannah Liam said, his voice a low warning rumble designed to intimidate. I saw Vanessa looking distressed from across the room. I do not know what kind of game you think you are playing by showing up here tonight, but let me make one thing absolutely clear. You are not going to ruin this evening with your lingering bitterness. I simply looked at him, my expression perfectly blank. I am not playing any games, Liam, I replied, my tone mild and completely devoid of the hurt he was clearly hoping to hear. I am simply enjoying a glass of champagne and observing the jewelry. Liam scoffed a harsh, dismissive sound. He puffed out his chest, stepping even closer. You know exactly what you are doing. You came back because you could not stand the thought of us succeeding without you. But you need to understand your place. My career is about to peak, Savannah. I am not the same junior executive you left behind 5 years ago. I am running the show now, and I will not allow your pathetic attempts at causing drama to cast a shadow over my accomplishments. He took another sip of his scotch, his eyes darting quickly to the surrounding guests to ensure they were adequately impressed by his show of authority. Richard just promoted me to senior partner, Liam announced, practically vibrating with self-importance. The words hung in the air, heavy with his desperate need for validation. It is the fastest promotion in the history of the firm. And do you know why? Because I am currently handling a massive international acquisition that is going to save this entire company. I am brokering a deal that will secure our legacy for the next 50 years. It is high-level, complex corporate finance. The kind of high-stakes maneuvering you never had the stomach for. Vanessa, emboldened by her husband's aggressive posturing, stepped out from behind his shoulder. Her panic over the flawed emerald ring temporarily forgotten, she eagerly joined the assault. He is brilliant, Vanessa chimed in, her voice shrill and grating. The entire board of directors practically bows down to him. Liam is negotiating with a massive European conglomerate. They are flying in a key investor tonight just to finalize the paperwork. It is a multi-million-dollar buyout, Savannah. A real business deal. Not like those little Spanish motels you have been pretending to manage. Liam chuckled, shaking his head as if the very thought of my career was a hilarious joke. Oh yes, we heard about your little hospitality project. Patricia told us you scraped together some pennies to open a boutique hotel. Or was it a bed and breakfast? Honestly, it is cute that you found a hobby to keep yourself busy after you ran away. But running a few tourist traps in Barcelona is child's play compared to what we do here. We are moving billions. You are probably just folding towels and complaining about the plumbing. My mother nodded enthusiastically. It is exactly as we predicted, she added, her voice dripping with maternal condescension. You lack the fundamental discipline for the corporate world. You always did. We tried to mold you into a proper executive, but you simply did not have the pedigree for it. It is a good thing Liam stepped up to take the reins. He actually understands the weight of our family name. The sheer volume of their delusion was genuinely staggering. They were standing in front of me, aggressively boasting about a European acquisition, completely oblivious to the fact that I was the phantom buyer they were so desperately trying to impress. They were mocking my hospitality empire, an empire that generated more revenue in a single quarter than Richard's entire firm had seen in the last decade. I did not defend my hotels. I did not correct their assumptions about my net worth. I did not raise my voice or try to match their frantic, aggressive energy. True power does not explain itself to irrelevance. Instead, I smiled. It was a slow, genuinely amused smile that clearly caught Liam off guard. I casually lifted my left wrist, letting the sleeve of my silk gown fall back slightly. I made a great show of checking the time on my watch. It was a custom timepiece, a rare masterpiece of Swiss engineering that Dominic had gifted me for our first wedding anniversary. It cost more than Liam's entire luxury car, but the design was so sleek and understated that Liam's untrained eyes simply registered it as a shiny accessory. I tapped the crystal face of the watch, completely ignoring his monologue about being a senior partner. Is that so? I murmured, my voice light and airy. A massive European acquisition. How very exciting for you, Liam. I am sure the paperwork must be exhausting. Liam frowned, his thick brows drawing together in utter confusion. He had expected me to yell. He had expected me to defend my business or break down in tears over his promotion. My total lack of engagement was short-circuiting his ego. He opened his mouth, clearly trying to think of a sharper insult, a deeper cut to elicit the reaction he so desperately craved. Before Liam could launch into another tirade, the sharp screech of microphone feedback echoed through the grand ballroom. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The low hum of conversation from the hundreds of elite guests died down instantly. I turned my head toward the sound. Standing on the grand elevated stage at the far end of the room was my father. Richard was dressed in a bespoke tuxedo that cost more than most people's annual salary, but the harsh spotlight revealed the deep, exhausted lines etched into his face. The dark circles under his eyes betrayed the immense, crushing stress of a man whose financial empire was secretly crumbling beneath his feet. But tonight, in front of the city's elite, he was determined to play the invincible king. He gripped the silver microphone tightly in his right hand, his knuckles white. He looked out over the sea of wealthy socialites, his gaze sweeping the room until it locked directly onto me. A hush fell over the crowd as the guests realized where Richard's attention was focused. The guests at the tables nearest to us stopped pretending to ignore the drama and openly turned in their chairs to watch. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard's voice boomed through the massive speakers filling every corner of the ballroom. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate my 70th birthday and the continued unparalleled success of our firm. As many of you know, family has always been the cornerstone of my business philosophy. We believe in taking care of our own even when they stumble." He paused, letting the silence stretch for dramatic effect. He was putting on a masterful performance, portraying himself as the benevolent, forgiving patriarch. "I see my daughter Savannah has decided to grace us with her presence tonight." Richard continued, his voice dripping with weaponized pity. "It has been 5 long years since she left Chicago to find herself. We have all worried about her out there in Europe, trying to make it on her own without the support of the family firm." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. Some guests cast sympathetic glances toward my father, while others stared at me with unabashed judgment. Richard took a step closer to the edge of the stage, speaking directly to me, ensuring every single person in the room heard his next words. "Savannah, my dear," Richard said, his tone dripping with a sickeningly sweet condescension. "I know things have not been easy for you. I know running a few little tourist properties cannot possibly pay the bills. But you are still my daughter. And tonight, in the spirit of family and forgiveness, I want to make you a public offer." He gestured grandly with his free hand. "If you are finally ready to give up this foolish rebellion, if you are finally ready to get a real job, we have a place for you. It is not an executive role, of course. You do not have the experience for that anymore. But we have a low-level administrative position opening up in the filing department next week. It pays a modest, steady wage. It will give you a chance to learn the value of hard work and humility. We are willing to take you back and give you a desk. All you have to do is say yes." The sheer audacity of the offer was breathtaking. He was not trying to help me. He was trying to publicly break me. He was offering me a filing job in front of the most powerful people in Chicago to solidify his narrative that I was a destitute failure crawling back for a handout. It was a calculated, vicious attempt to strip away every ounce of my dignity. Liam chuckled softly beside me, crossing his arms over his chest. "Take the job, Savannah," he whispered maliciously. "It is the best offer you are ever going to get." Vanessa smirked finally, looking completely satisfied. "You should be grateful he is even speaking to you," she added. The entire ballroom held its breath, waiting for my reaction. They waited for me to lower my head in shame. They waited for me to quietly accept the humiliating charity of my benevolent father. They waited for me to surrender. I stood perfectly still in my midnight blue silk gown, the diamond on my left hand catching the light of the chandeliers. I looked at Liam. I looked at Vanessa. I looked at my mother, who was practically vibrating with vindictive joy. And finally, I looked at my father standing on his stage, gripping his microphone, completely blind to the fact that he was standing on a trap door. I took a slow, deliberate breath, preparing to decline his generous offer in a way that would shatter their entire reality. I held Liam's hostile gaze without blinking. 5 years ago, the sight of him in a tailored tuxedo would have made my heart race with blind affection. Now he just looked like a man trying entirely too hard to play a part he had not earned. He took a long, slow sip of his expensive scotch, the ice clinking sharply against the crystal glass, before he marched directly into the small circle of tension that had formed around Vanessa, my mother, and myself. Seeing his wife visibly trembling and clutching her flawed emerald ring like a lifeline, Liam immediately positioned himself slightly in front of her. It was a protective stance that felt entirely performative, designed purely for the audience of Chicago socialites who were watching our every move from the periphery. He puffed out his chest, the expensive fabric of his jacket stretching tightly across his broad shoulders, and glared down at me with absolute unmasked contempt. Savannah, Liam said, his voice a low warning rumble designed to intimidate. I do not know what kind of sick game you think you are playing by showing up here tonight uninvited, but let me make one thing absolutely clear. You are not going to ruin this evening with your lingering bitterness. We are not going to let your pathetic jealousy destroy a night meant for celebration. I simply looked at him, my expression perfectly blank. I am not playing any games, Liam, I replied, my tone mild and completely devoid of the hurt he was clearly hoping to hear. I am simply enjoying a glass of champagne and admiring the family jewelry. It is quite the fascinating collection. Liam scoffed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed over the soft, elegant music of the string quartet playing in the corner. You know exactly what you are doing. You came back because you could not stand the thought of us succeeding without you. You wanted to see if we were miserable, but you are the only one who looks miserable. You need to understand your place in this room. My career is about to peak, Savannah. I am not the same junior executive you left behind 5 years ago. I am running the show now, and I will absolutely not allow your pathetic attempts at causing drama to cast a shadow over my accomplishments. You had your chance to be a part of this world, and you threw it away like a spoiled child. Do not think you can just waltz back in here and throw a tantrum because you deeply regret your foolish choices. He took another aggressive sip of his scotch, his eyes darting quickly to the surrounding guests to ensure they were adequately impressed by his show of unyielding authority. Richard just promoted me to senior partner, Liam announced, practically vibrating with self-importance. The words hung in the heavy air, thick with his desperate need for validation. It is the fastest promotion in the entire history of the firm. And do you know exactly why I got it? Because I am currently handling a massive international acquisition that is going to single-handedly save this entire company. I am brokering a deal that will secure our legacy for the next 50 years. It is high-level, highly complex corporate finance, the kind of high-stakes maneuvering you never had the stomach or the intellect to handle. Vanessa, emboldened by her husband's aggressive posturing, stepped out from behind his shoulder. Her panic over the fragile, flawed ring was temporarily forgotten as she eagerly joined the verbal assault. He is absolutely brilliant, Vanessa chimed in, her voice shrill and grating against my ears. The entire board of directors practically bows down to him. Liam is negotiating with a massive European conglomerate. They are flying in a key billionaire investor tonight just to finalize the paperwork and sign the contracts. It is a multi-million-dollar buyout, Savannah. A real business deal. Not like those little Spanish motels you have been pretending to manage overseas. Liam chuckled, shaking his head as if the very thought of my career was a hilarious, pathetic joke. Oh yes, we heard all about your little hospitality project. Patricia told us you scraped together some pennies to open a boutique hotel. Or was it a bed and breakfast? Honestly, it is cute that you found a little hobby to keep yourself busy after you ran away from real responsibilities. But running a few cheap tourist traps in Barcelona is absolute child's play compared to what we do here in the real world. We are moving billions of dollars. You are probably just folding towels and complaining about the plumbing in a rundown hostel. The sheer volume of their delusion was genuinely staggering. They were standing directly in front of me, aggressively boasting about a European acquisition that was supposed to be their ultimate salvation, completely oblivious to the fact that I was the exact type of predator they were trying so desperately to attract. They were actively mocking my hospitality empire, an empire that generated more pristine revenue in a single financial quarter than Richard's entire aging firm had seen in the last decade. I did not defend my luxury hotels. I did not correct their laughable assumptions about my current net worth. I did not raise my voice or try to match their frantic, aggressive energy. True power never has to explain itself to irrelevance. Instead, I smiled. It was a slow, genuinely amused smile that clearly caught Liam off guard. I casually lifted my left wrist, letting the sleeve of my midnight blue silk gown fall back slightly to expose my wrist. I made a great, unhurried show of checking the time on my watch. It was a custom timepiece, a rare masterpiece of Swiss engineering that Dominic had commissioned and gifted me for our first wedding anniversary. It cost significantly more than Liam's entire customized luxury vehicle parked outside, but the design was so sleek, modern, and understated that Liam's untrained, arrogant eyes simply registered it as a shiny accessory. I tapped the crystal face of the watch with a manicured finger, completely ignoring his long-winded monologue about being a senior partner. "Is that so?" I murmured, my voice light, airy, and thoroughly unbothered. "A massive European acquisition. How very exciting for you, Liam. I am sure the mountain of paperwork must be positively exhausting for someone of your caliber." Liam frowned heavily, his thick brows drawing together in utter confusion. He had expected me to yell. He had expected me to violently defend my business or break down in humiliating tears over his incredible promotion. My total lack of engagement was completely short-circuiting his fragile ego. He opened his mouth clearly, trying to quickly formulate a sharper insult, a much deeper cut to elicit the explosive reaction he so desperately craved. He needed me to feel small so he could feel big. He desperately needed me to be the broken failure his narrative required. Before Liam could launch into another vicious tirade, the sharp, highly unpleasant screech of microphone feedback echoed through the grand ballroom. The string quartet in the corner abruptly stopped playing mid-note. The low buzzing hum of conversation from the hundreds of elite guests died down, instantly replaced by a thick, heavy silence. I turned my head toward the piercing sound. Standing on the grand elevated stage at the far end of the room was my father. Richard was dressed in a bespoke tuxedo that cost more than most people's annual salary, but the harsh, bright spotlight revealed the deep, exhausted lines firmly etched into his aging face. He gripped a silver microphone tightly in his right hand. He had clearly noticed the commotion happening near the swinging kitchen doors, and he was not a man who allowed anyone else to steal the spotlight at his own birthday gala. Richard marched down the carpeted steps of the stage, the microphone still securely in his hand. The wealthy crowd parted for him like the Red Sea as he made his way directly toward our small, incredibly tense circle. He looked out over the sea of wealthy socialites, ensuring all eyes in the room were glued to the unfolding drama before he even spoke a word. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard's voice boomed through the massive speakers filling every single corner of the ornate ballroom. "I see we have a surprise guest joining us tonight. My prodigal daughter, Savannah, has decided to grace us with her presence after 5 long years of running away from her familial duties and responsibilities." A collective murmur rippled through the crowd. Some guests cast sympathetic, pitying glances toward my father, while others stared at me with unabashed, cold judgment. Richard stopped right next to Liam, placing a heavy paternal hand on the younger man's shoulder. He looked me up and down with an expression of profound, highly theatrical disappointment. He was playing to the gallery, and he was putting on a masterclass in manipulation. "I know things have been incredibly difficult for you over in Spain, Savannah," Richard said, his voice dripping with weaponized, sickly sweet pity. "I know running a few little tourist properties cannot possibly pay the bills, and you must be struggling immensely to keep your head above water, but you are still my daughter. And tonight, in the spirit of family unity and forgiveness, I want to make you a very public offer." He gestured grandly with his free hand, ensuring the investors at the back of the room caught the full magnitude of his benevolence. "If you are finally ready to give up this foolish rebellion, if you are finally ready to put down your pride and get a real job, we have a place for you. It is not an executive role, of course, You simply do not have the experience or the discipline for that level of work anymore. But we have a low-level administrative position opening up in the filing department next week. It pays a modest, steady wage. It will give you a chance to learn the true value of hard work and humility under Liam's brilliant, capable leadership. We are willing to take you back and give you a desk in the basement. All you have to do is swallow your pride and say yes. Before the maitre d' could articulate a single syllable, Patricia shattered the heavy anticipatory silence that had draped itself over our table. Her face was flushed an angry, mottled red, and her hands trembled as she clutched her linen napkin. She could not stand watching Liam sweat under my relentless financial dissection. She could not bear the suspicious, calculating glances the wealthy investors were now shooting at her chosen golden boy. Desperate to reclaim the narrative and re-establish the strict family hierarchy, she deployed the only weapon she possessed in her limited intellectual arsenal. "You are making a complete fool of yourself, Savannah," Patricia announced, her voice intentionally loud enough to carry to the neighboring tables. She turned her body away from me, physically blocking me out of her line of sight as she beamed at Vanessa. Her smile was brittle and entirely manufactured. She reached across the fine crystal glasses and patted Vanessa's hand with exaggerated theatrical affection. "We are just so incredibly blessed to have Vanessa in this family." Patricia continued projecting her voice to ensure the maximum number of guests could hear her pointed praise. "She is the very definition of a true supportive wife. She stands by her husband, she lifts him up. She understands that a woman's true value comes from her grace, her elegance, and her ability to nurture a successful man's career. She does not spend her time asking aggressive masculine questions or trying to tear down the people who are actually building something meaningful." Vanessa preened under the spotlight of my mother's approval. She lifted her chin, her chest puffing out slightly as she adjusted the strap of her designer gown. She shot me a look of pure, unadulterated triumph, entirely confident that Patricia had just delivered a fatal blow to my ego. "It is such a tragedy." Patricia sighed, her tone dripping with weaponized, toxic pity. "It is a genuine tragedy that you never learned how to be a partner, Savannah. Look at you, 30 years old, completely unmarried, sitting here alone and bitterly interrogating a brilliant man just because you are jealous of his achievements. No successful man wants a woman who constantly questions him. No wonder you are entirely alone. It is exactly why you could never hold on to a relationship. You are so busy trying to prove you are the smartest person in the room that you forgot how to be a woman." The investors seated near us awkwardly averted their eyes, pretending to be deeply fascinated by their silverware. The sheer cruelty of Patricia's public shaming was palpable, hanging in the air like thick, suffocating smoke. She wanted me to shrink. She wanted me to lower my head to feel the crushing weight of my supposed spinsterhood, to apologize for daring to challenge the men who ruled her world. I did not shrink. I did not break eye contact. I calmly set my crystal wine glass down on the table, the delicate chime of glass against wood ringing clearly in the sudden quiet. I offered my mother a smile so serene, so utterly devoid of the devastation she expected, that it caused her confident expression to falter. She had no idea that her insults were completely meaningless. She had no idea that I was not an unmarried, bitter dropout. She had no idea that my husband, the man she was currently mourning my lack of, was standing just on the other side of those ballroom doors, preparing to buy her entire world. Before Patricia could launch into another volley of character assassination, the maitre d' finally struck the small silver chime in his hand. The clear, resonant note sliced through the lingering tension at our table, commanding the absolute attention of every single guest in the grand ballroom. The low murmur of hundreds of conversations instantly ceased. The room fell so incredibly silent that you could hear the soft rustle of silk gowns and the clinking of ice in glasses. "Ladies and gentlemen," the maitre d' projected, his voice echoing off the high frescoed ceilings, "it is my distinct honor and profound privilege to announce the arrival of our most esteemed guest of the evening. Please welcome the Chief Executive Officer and founder of Ethelgard Holdings, Mr. Dominic Vance." The heavy, ornate double doors at the entrance of the dining hall swung open with a smooth, dramatic finality. The air in the room seemed to physically shift, the atmospheric pressure dropping as the man of the hour stepped across the threshold. Dominic was a vision of lethal, uncompromising authority. He wore a masterfully tailored midnight black tuxedo that clung perfectly to his broad shoulders and lean, athletic frame. The stark white of his crisp dress shirt contrasted sharply with his dark, perfectly styled hair and his piercing, storm-gray eyes. He moved with the effortless, predatory grace of a man who owned every inch of the ground he walked on. There was no hesitation in his stride, no nervous scanning of the crowd, no desperate need for approval. He possessed a quiet, terrifying gravity that instantly pulled the attention of every single billionaire politician and socialite in the room directly into his orbit. Two impeccably dressed executive assistants flanked him, moving in perfect synchronization, holding sleek leather portfolios that undoubtedly contained the fate of my father's crumbling empire. The reaction at my table was instantaneous and utterly pathetic. The moment Dominic's name echoed through the speakers, the blood rushed back into Liam's pale face, replaced by a feverish, manic flush of pure desperation. He completely abandoned his bowl of expensive lobster bisque, his silver spoon clattering loudly against the porcelain. He practically shoved his chair backward, the wooden legs screeching harshly against the polished marble floor. Richard mirrored his protégé's frantic panic. My father, a man who had spent his entire life cultivating an image of calm, untouchable patrician dignity, completely lost his composure. He knocked over his crystal water glass, in his haste to stand up, sending a puddle of ice water spreading across the heavy velvet tablecloth. He did not even bother to look down at the mess. His wide, desperate eyes were locked solely on Dominic. They must not keep him waiting. They had to be the first to greet him. They had to secure their lifeline before anyone else in the room could distract the billionaire's savior. "He is here," Liam gasped, his voice tight and breathless. "Richard, he is actually here. The deal is happening tonight." "Go," Richard hissed aggressively, straightening his tie with trembling fingers. "We must greet him immediately. Do not let him speak to the Henderson firm. We need him at our table right now." The two men abandoned their plates, their pride, and their families. They practically sprinted across the massive ballroom floor. It was a humiliating, degrading display of raw subservience. They dodged around the slow-moving waitstaff, nearly colliding with a tray of champagne flutes. Liam was visibly sweating, hastily wiping his damp palms on the sides of his expensive tuxedo trousers as he fast-walked. Richard was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he tried to maintain a brisk pace while forcing a wide, ingratiating smile onto his aging face. They looked exactly like starving dogs rushing toward a thrown scrap of meat. All their previous posturing, all their aggressive boasting about being titans of industry completely vanished. In the face of genuine, unimaginable wealth and power, Richard and Liam were reduced to groveling sycophants. Vanessa stood up slightly from her chair, her hands clasped together in nervous excitement as she watched her husband rush toward his supposed triumph. Patricia leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with greedy anticipation, fully expecting to witness the glorious moment her husband and future son-in-law secured the family's dynasty forever. I remained perfectly seated, crossing my legs elegantly and resting my chin on my hand. I watched the spectacular train wreck unfold with the detached clinical fascination of a scientist observing an experiment reaching its explosive conclusion. Richard and Liam intercepted Dominic just as he reached the center aisle of the ballroom, cutting off his path to the head table. They blocked his way with their frantic, breathless enthusiasm, inserting themselves directly into his personal space. "Mr. Vance!" Richard exclaimed, his voice slightly too loud, slightly too eager, echoing awkwardly in the quiet room. "What an absolute honor! We are so profoundly thrilled that you could join us this evening. Your presence here elevates this entire gala. Welcome to Chicago." Liam quickly stepped up beside his mentor, puffing out his chest and flashing his most practiced, charismatic salesman smile. The sheer desperation radiating from his pores was practically visible. Dominic, Liam said, adopting a tone of forced familiar camaraderie that he absolutely had not earned. "It is incredibly good to see you again in person. We have everything prepared for the signing. The private suite is ready upstairs whenever you wish to review the final valuation documents. We are incredibly excited to officially welcome Ethelgard Holdings into our firm's family. I assure you my financial models are exactly what we discussed in our emails. Richard enthusiastically nodded his agreement, stepping closer. He thrust his right hand forward, his palm open and eager, ready to physically grasp the lifeline that would save him from total bankruptcy and public ruin. "We are entirely at your disposal tonight, Mr. Vance," Richard groveled. "Please let me personally escort you to the head table. We have reserved the best seat in the house exclusively for you." Richard stood there, his hand extended in the air, his desperate smile frozen on his face. He waited for the firm, respectful handshake that would seal their partnership and validate his existence in front of the city's elite. Dominic stopped walking. He stood perfectly still, his tall frame towering over Richard and Liam. He did not return their frantic smiles. He did not utter a single word of polite greeting. He did not acknowledge their desperate flattery. Slowly, deliberately, Dominic lowered his piercing gray eyes to look at Richard's extended, sweating hand. He stared at the trembling fingers suspended in the empty space between them. The silence stretched for one agonizing, humiliating second. Then two, then three. Dominic did not reach out. He did not take my father's hand. He ignored it completely, leaving Richard's arm hanging awkwardly in the air for the entire ballroom to witness. Instead of acknowledging the two men practically begging at his feet, Dominic lifted his head. His cold, clinical gaze swept over Richard and Liam as if they were nothing more than minor, unpleasant obstacles blocking his path. He looked past them, his eyes scanning the hushed, breathless crowd with laser precision, searching for someone highly specific. The moment his eyes found mine across the sprawling, opulent room, the freezing clinical detachment in his gaze instantly melted away. A subtle, almost imperceptible warmth flooded his expression, a private shift meant entirely for me. He did not offer a polite nod or a respectful bow to the self-proclaimed titans of Chicago finance who were currently suffocating his personal space. He simply stepped around them. The dismissal was so absolute, so casually brutal, that it sent a physical shockwave through the guests standing nearby. Dominic moved with the fluid, unbothered momentum of a predator brushing past a cluster of dry leaves. He completely bypassed my father, leaving Richard standing paralyzed in the center aisle, his right hand still foolishly extended toward the empty air where his savior had been standing, just a fraction of a second prior. The air seemed to leave Richard's lungs in a sudden, sharp rush. He blinked rapidly, his mind entirely unable to process the total rejection he had just endured on the most public stage imaginable. Beside him, Liam looked as though he had been physically struck. The arrogant, triumphant smirk that had plastered his face all evening slid right off, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of sheer, unadulterated panic. The heavy, suffocating silence in the ballroom deepened, pressing down on the guests, until it felt difficult to breathe. The ambient noise of clinking silverware and polite murmurs was completely gone. Hundreds of pairs of eyes darted frantically back and forth between the humiliated patriarch frozen in the aisle and the billionaire CEO who was now striding purposefully across the polished marble floor. Every step Dominic took echoed loudly in the cavernous space. The rhythmic, confident sound of his leather shoes against the floorboards sounded like the steady ticking of a countdown clock. And he was walking directly toward my table. Patricia, oblivious to the impending catastrophe, misinterpreted the situation entirely. Her vanity was a bottomless well that blinded her to reality. Seeing the most powerful man in the room approaching our section, she immediately assumed he was coming to pay his respects to the matriarch of the firm he was about to acquire. She hastily straightened her posture, smoothing the front of her designer gown and tilting her head to showcase her expensive diamond necklace. She shot me a venomous, triumphant glare, silently commanding me to witness her ultimate moment of social validation. She genuinely believed Dominic was marching over to solidify her husband's legacy and elevate her status to the highest echelon of global wealth. Vanessa mirrored my mother's foolish anticipation, leaning forward in her seat, practically vibrating with excitement. She was already mentally calculating the bragging rights she would secure by simply breathing the same air as the elusive CEO of Ethelgard Holdings. Dominic did not even glance at them. He walked right past Patricia's eagerly awaiting smile. He completely ignored Vanessa's desperate, wide-eyed stare. He did not acknowledge their existence in any capacity whatsoever. He stopped directly behind my chair. The collective intake of breath from the surrounding tables was audible. I could feel the intense, burning heat of hundreds of stares locked onto us, completely bewildered by this impossible sequence of events. Why was the billionaire savior of the corporate world ignoring the senior partner and the firm's founder to stand behind the disgraced banished daughter? Dominic reached out with large, capable hands and gently grasped the back of my chair. With effortless grace, he pulled it back just enough for me to turn toward him. I tilted my head up, meeting his storm gray eyes, allowing the genuine, unmasked affection I felt for this man to finally show on my face. He reached down, his strong fingers gently enveloping my hand. The warmth of his skin was a comforting, solid anchor amidst the chaotic storm of my family's impending destruction. He smoothly guided me to stand up. As I rose, the soft rustle of my silk gown sounded deafening in the dead quiet of the room. Dominic did not offer a polite handshake. He did not offer a formal professional greeting suitable for a corporate gala. Instead, he pulled me flush against his chest, his arm wrapping securely around my waist. He dipped his head, his hand coming up to gently cup the side of my face, and he kissed me. It was not a brief, socially acceptable peck on the cheek. It was a deep, lingering, unapologetically possessive kiss that staked an absolute, undeniable claim. It was a kiss that shattered every single lie my family had constructed about my pathetic, lonely existence. It was a kiss that told the entire room of Chicago elites exactly who I belonged to and exactly who belonged to me. When he finally pulled back, he kept his arm firmly anchored around my waist, keeping me tucked against his side. He looked down at me, a soft, intimate smile playing on his lips, completely ignoring the massive audience watching our every move. "Sorry I am late, my love," Dominic said. He did not whisper it. He did not keep it private. He projected his deep, resonant voice clearly, ensuring that the words carried effortlessly over the heavy silence to the adjacent tables, to the waiting maitre d', and to the paralyzed men standing in the center aisle. The flight was delayed over the Atlantic. Dominic continued brushing a stray lock of hair behind my ear with profound tenderness. "I told the pilot to push the engines, but you know how cautious the aviation authority can be. I hope you have not been incredibly bored waiting for me among this crowd." The sheer casual arrogance of his apology, referring to the city's most powerful socialites and businessmen as a potentially boring crowd, sent an absolute shockwave of pure devastation through our immediate vicinity. The impact was instantaneous and catastrophic. To my right, a sharp, violent crash shattered the dead silence. Patricia had gone completely rigid, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. The muscles in her hands simply gave out, and the expensive crystal champagne flute she had been holding slipped from her trembling fingers. It hit the polished marble floor with a sickening shatter, sending a spray of expensive champagne and jagged shards of crystal flying across the tips of her designer shoes. She did not even jump at the noise. She remained completely frozen, staring at Dominic's arm, wrapped securely around my waist, as if she were looking at a terrifying apparition. Her mouth opened and closed silently, her mind violently rejecting the reality unfolding right in front of her. Vanessa looked like she had just been physically struck by a speeding train. Her jaw had literally dropped open, her perfectly applied lipstick completely ruined by her slack, horrified expression. The smug, vicious triumph that had defined her features all night was entirely gone, replaced by a pale, sickly shade of absolute terror. She stared at me, then at Dominic, then back at me, her eyes darting frantically as she tried to process how the despised, unemployed sister-in-law had just been passionately kissed by the billionaire they were depending on to save their entire lives. but the most spectacular system failure belonged entirely to Liam. He had finally managed to unfreeze his legs, stumbling awkwardly forward from the center aisle until he was standing just a few feet away from our table. His face was a mask of sheer, unadulterated panic. The confident, aggressive aura of the newly minted senior partner had vanished completely, leaving behind a terrified, stammering shell of a man who suddenly realized he had stepped into a minefield. He looked at Dominic's hand resting protectively on my hip. He looked at my calm, serene smile. The pieces were slowly, painfully clicking together in his mind, but his massive ego desperately fought against the catastrophic conclusion. "Mr. Vance?" Liam stammered, his voice cracking horribly. He sounded breathless, like a man drowning. "Mr. Vance, I do not understand. You know Savannah." He pointed a shaking finger at me, his eyes wide and frantic. His mind could not reconcile the narrative he had built with the reality standing before him. How could the billionaire CEO know the failure of the family? Why was he apologizing to her? Why did he call her his love? Dominic finally shifted his gaze away from me, turning his cold, piercing gray eyes onto Liam. The warmth that had been there just seconds ago vanished completely, replaced by a lethal, uncompromising frost. He looked at Liam the way one might look at an insect that had crawled onto a dining table, a minor nuisance that needed to be swiftly eradicated. I smiled, letting the sweet, intoxicating taste of absolute victory wash over me. The trap had been sprung. The cage had closed. Every insult, every condescending remark, every attempt to humiliate me over the past 5 years had culminated in this exact, perfect moment. I smoothly slid my hand up Dominic's chest, linking my arms securely through his. I leaned slightly against his solid strength, feeling completely grounded and utterly untouchable. I turned my head, my eyes locking onto Liam's terrified, pale face, and then shifting to look at my father, who had managed to stumble closer, his face the color of old ash. I offered them both a razor-sharp smile, a smile that promised absolute, uncompromising destruction. "Dad, Liam," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent, breathless room, ringing with undeniable authority. It seems we skipped formal introductions in all the excitement. "Meet Dominic, my husband of 3 years." Richard let out a sharp, barking laugh that sounded more like a dry, painful cough. He reached up with a trembling hand to wipe a bead of cold sweat that had suddenly materialized on his deeply lined forehead. "A husband," Richard loudly declared, looking around at the silent crowd as if begging them to share in the humor of the situation. "My daughter has always had a very vivid imagination, Mr. Vance, a flair for the dramatic. It is exactly why she was never quite suited for the rigorous, highly serious world of corporate finance." He tried to step forward to physically separate Dominic from me, reaching out with a forced, jovial smile to clap a hand onto Dominic's shoulder in a display of manufactured male camaraderie. He wanted to guide the billionaire away from the toxic influence of his outcast daughter. Dominic shifted his weight just a fraction of an inch. It was a subtle freezing movement that made my father's hand drop back to his side before it could even make contact. The sheer authority radiating from my husband formed an invisible, impenetrable wall around us. "We can discuss Savannah's little jokes and delusions later," Richard insisted, his voice growing tighter, a sharp edge of genuine panic creeping into his polished patrician tone. "The private study is completely prepped and waiting for us. The entire board of directors is standing by upstairs with a bottle of vintage champagne on ice. The acquisition papers are perfectly drafted and ready for your immediate signature. Let us leave the women to their gossip and handle the real business of the evening. We have a historic deal to close." Liam eagerly nodded, practically vibrating out of his tailored tuxedo. He looked like a desperate man trying to bail water out of a sinking ship with a thimble. "Exactly," Liam chimed in, wiping his clammy hands on his trousers again. "The forward-looking projections I sent you last week are absolutely solid. We are ready to execute this merger right now. I have the pens ready." Dominic did not even blink. He looked at the two men with an expression of such profound, icy detachment that it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The affectionate, loving warmth he had shown me mere moments ago had been entirely replaced by the ruthless, predatory chief executive officer persona that made him a feared titan in the European financial markets. He did not see a father and a son-in-law. He saw two incompetent liabilities. "There will be no signing tonight," Richard Dominic stated. His voice was not loud, but it carried an undeniable lethal authority that echoed clearly across the silent, breathless ballroom. "In fact, there will be no signing at all. Ethelgard Holdings is officially pulling out of the acquisition. The deal is dead." A collective audible gasp rippled through the hundreds of elite guests gathered in the room. The incredibly wealthy investors seated at the surrounding tables immediately leaned forward in their chairs, their expressions shifting rapidly from polite curiosity to sharp, calculating alarm. They knew exactly what this meant. Richard's firm was hemorrhaging money. Everyone in the inner circle whispered about the defaulted loans and the plunging revenue. This European buyout was their only lifeline. Without Ethelgard Holdings injecting massive capital into the failing infrastructure, the company would absolutely collapse within the quarter. Richard physically swayed on his feet, looking as though Dominic had just driven a physical blade directly into his stomach. The remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. Pulling out, Richard repeated the words stumbling out of his mouth in a broken, hollow whisper. "Dominic, please. You cannot be serious. We have a firm verbal agreement. We have been negotiating this merger for the better part of a year. You cannot simply walk away from a deal of this massive magnitude over a petty family squabble. This is business. We do not let personal feelings interfere with billion-dollar acquisitions." "I assure you my decision has absolutely nothing to do with a family squabble," Dominic replied smoothly, his tone remarkably calm despite the absolute devastation he was raining down upon them. He reached down and gently laced his strong fingers through mine, a highly public, undeniable display of our unbreakable partnership. "It has everything to do with incredibly incompetent leadership, deeply fraudulent financial projections, and a toxic, archaic corporate culture that Ethelgard Holdings absolutely refuses to associate with." Patricia, who had been standing completely frozen beside our table, finally found her voice. The shock had worn off, replaced by a frantic, clawing need to protect her collapsing social standing. "This is her fault!" my mother shrieked, pointing a manicured, violently trembling finger directly at my face. The mask of the elegant, unbothered socialite was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, vindictive fury that made her look years older. "Savannah poisoned you against us. She lied to you because she is deeply jealous of Liam and his incredible success. She is a college dropout who runs cheap motels in Spain. You cannot possibly listen to a single word she says. She is just trying to destroy us because she failed at everything she ever attempted." Dominic's storm-gray eyes snapped toward my mother. The sheer freezing intensity of his glare made Patricia physically recoil. Her hand dropped back to her side as if she had been burned, and she took a hasty, frightened step backward, bumping into Vanessa. "I strongly advise you to watch exactly how you speak about my wife." Dominic warned, his tone dangerously soft, yet carrying a lethal promise of retribution. "And I strongly advise you to understand exactly who you are dealing with before you embarrass yourself and your failing husband any further." Dominic turned his attention back to the wider room, addressing the massive crowd of investors and socialites who were hanging on to his every word. They were witnessing the brutal, spectacular execution of a Chicago dynasty, and no one dared to look away. "My wife is not a dropout, and she certainly does not run cheap motels," Dominic declared, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "When Savannah left Chicago 5 years ago, she came to Europe with a vision. A brilliant, revolutionary vision for luxury hospitality that traditional, stagnant, dying firms like this one completely failed to recognize or nurture." He looked down at me, a fierce, undeniable pride shining brightly in his eyes before he looked back at my paralyzed, hyperventilating father. "Ethelgard Holdings is a massive global conglomerate, Richard. But we did not start that way. We built this empire together brick by brick. Savannah is the co-founder and the majority shareholder of our most profitable division. The European hospitality branch that generated more net profit in the last fiscal year than your entire aging firm has seen in its entire existence. She is not just my wife, she is my equal partner. I do not make a single major acquisition, and I certainly do not sign any multi-million-dollar buyout contracts without her direct explicit approval. And she has firmly decided that your company is a toxic, worthless investment. The silence in the grand ballroom was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating quiet, heavy with the incredible weight of shattered illusions and completely destroyed egos. Vanessa let out a small, strangled whimper from behind Patricia. She stared at me with wide, horrified eyes, her gaze dropping to the stunning, flawless diamond on my left hand. She was finally realizing that the borrowed wealth she had been flaunting all evening was absolutely nothing compared to the vast international empire I quietly commanded. Her entire identity, built on the fragile premise that she had married the superior, successful man, was collapsing into dust in real time. She looked physically ill, her hands gripping the edges of the velvet tablecloth to keep herself upright. Richard looked like he was going to be physically sick right there on the polished marble floor. His jaw worked silently as he stared at me, the daughter he had aggressively dismissed, constantly belittled, and publicly offered a humiliating minimum-wage basement filing job just moments ago. He had spent years actively telling everyone in his elite social circle that I was a failure, a tragic cautionary tale of what happens when a woman does not follow his strict patriarchal rules. Now he was standing in front of the city's most powerful, influential people, publicly exposed as an absolute fool who had carelessly thrown away the most successful, brilliant mind his family had ever produced. "But the audits," Liam suddenly blurted out, his voice cracking violently in the painfully quiet room. He was sweating profusely now, heavy drops of moisture rolling down his pale temples. His tailored tuxedo suddenly looked rumpled and entirely too large for his rapidly shrinking frame. He stepped forward, waving his hands in a frantic, disjointed gesture. He was clinging to the only piece of reality he thought he still controlled. "Dominic, listen to me," Liam pleaded, his voice rising in pitch. "The financial models I sent you, the revenue projections, the European audit team absolutely loved them. They approved every single metric. We have been emailing back and forth for the past 6 months. I answered all their highly technical questions. I provided the supplemental data. They specifically said my forward-looking projections were brilliantly structured and perfectly sound." Liam looked around wildly, his eyes darting to the wealthy investors at the nearby tables, begging anyone in the room to validate his corporate genius. "The deal is sound. The firm is perfectly leveraged. The auditors confirmed it in writing. There is no reason to pull out." Dominic let out a low, dark chuckle that completely lacked any warmth or humor. It was the terrifying sound of an apex predator cornering its wounded prey. He looked down at me, his eyes gleaming with dark amusement, deferring the final fatal blow to the woman who had meticulously orchestrated this entire beautiful masterpiece of corporate revenge. I took a slow, elegant step forward, releasing Dominic's arm, but staying comfortably within the highly protective circle of his powerful presence. I looked directly into Liam's wide, terrified, bloodshot eyes. The desperate, arrogant golden boy who had tried to intimidate me just 5 minutes ago had completely vanished, leaving behind a pathetic, trembling fraud. "You really are incredibly arrogant, Liam," I said, my voice carrying a lethal, surgical precision that cut through the silence like a scalpel. "You were so entirely confident in your magical ability to successfully hide $30 million of bleeding corporate debt that you never even bothered to thoroughly check the credentials of the people you were sending your fabricated ledgers to." Liam swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his throat. "What are you talking about?" he choked out, taking a small involuntary step backward. "The European audit team you have been so incredibly proud of communicating with for the past 6 months," I continued, thoroughly savoring the absolute, undeniable destruction of his reality. "The team that endlessly praised your creative financial modeling. The anonymous, faceless analysts you thought you had successfully fooled with your wildly inflated multipliers and your completely fabricated fictional revenue projections." I tilted my head, offering my former fiancé a smile that was entirely devoid of mercy or forgiveness. "That was not a standard European audit team, Liam." I stated my words ringing with crystal clarity across the silent, captivated ballroom. That was my personal forensic accounting team. I have been personally reading your cooked books, analyzing your deeply fraudulent projections, and tracking every single one of your defaulted construction loans for half a year. I watched the exact moment Liam's soul seemed to leave his physical body. His knees buckled, and he had to instinctively reach out and grip the heavy wooden back of an empty dining chair to prevent himself from collapsing entirely onto the floor. You thought you were negotiating with some faceless corporate entity. I pressed on, refusing to let him breathe or formulate an excuse. You thought you could just shuffle the numbers around, hide the massive deficits in offshore holding companies, and present a shiny, profitable facade to secure your highly unearned promotion to senior partner. But every single email you sent, every single adjusted spreadsheet you proudly submitted to Ethelgard Holdings went directly to my private inbox. I watched you deliberately commit corporate fraud in real time, Liam. I have the digital paper trail of you knowingly inflating the firm's assets to secure this buyout. Richard let out a strangled gasp, desperately clutching his chest. He turned to Liam, his eyes wide with a new, much more dangerous kind of terror. Fraud. Richard wheezed. Liam, what did you do? I did exactly what I promised I said, shifting my gaze back to my father. I promised I would let him hang himself with his own massive ego. And he did. You handed the keys to your entire empire to a man who just handed me all the evidence I need to have the Securities and Exchange Commission completely dismantle this firm by tomorrow morning. The silence in the room stretched until it threatened to snap. Richard stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, unable to draw oxygen into his collapsing lungs. Liam was practically vibrating with terror, his knuckles turning stark white as he gripped the heavy wooden back of the dining chair. His desperate, pleading eyes darted from my face to Dominic's, searching for any sign that this was merely an elaborate, cruel prank. He found absolutely zero mercy. Dominic did not need to issue a verbal command. He merely gave a microscopic, almost imperceptible nod to the senior executive assistant standing rigidly at his right shoulder. The assistant, a man whose expression was as perfectly blank and ruthless as his employer's, stepped forward with crisp, military precision. He unclasped the sleek leather portfolio he had been carrying all evening. With smooth, practiced efficiency, he withdrew a massive, heavily bound stack of documents. The front cover of the thick file was stamped with a bold, blood-red insignia that marked it as a highly classified, top-tier internal audit. Without uttering a single word, the assistant leaned over the velvet tablecloth and dropped the heavy dossier directly onto Liam's abandoned plate. The loud, heavy thud of the paper hitting the fine porcelain echoed like a gunshot in the dead quiet of the ballroom. The sudden impact sent a thick splash of cold lobster bisque flying across the pristine white linen and directly onto the immaculate sleeve of Liam's custom-tailored tuxedo. Liam flinched violently, a pathetic jerky movement, but he did not dare raise a hand to brush the stain away. He could only stare down at the red stamp on the cover of the dossier, as if it were a highly venomous snake coiled on his dinner plate ready to strike. "Go ahead and open it, Liam." I commanded, my voice projecting clearly over the hushed whispers that were beginning to ripple through the crowd of wealthy onlookers. I invite you to turn to page 1 and review your own spectacular handiwork. Liam did not move. He was completely paralyzed, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked physically ill, his previously tanned skin taking on a waxy greenish hue under the bright crystal chandeliers. Since my former fiancé seems to have suddenly lost his ability to function in a corporate setting, I continued, my tone ringing with lethal surgical precision. Allow me to summarize the highlights of this audit for the rest of the room. After all, transparency is the absolute cornerstone of good business. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, commanding the absolute attention of every single investor, politician, and rival CEO in the grand ballroom. I wanted them to hear every single detail of the catastrophe they had narrowly avoided. You took my father's failing company, a firm that has been actively hemorrhaging premium clients and bleeding capital for 3 straight consecutive years, and you tried to paint it gold, I announced loudly. You created a phantom ledger. You took commercial properties that were sitting completely vacant, crumbling buildings that were draining massive amounts of maintenance costs, and you listed them as fully leased high-yield assets. You deliberately moved the firm's crushing operational debts into a series of obscure newly formed shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands. You conveniently kept those massive toxic liabilities entirely off the primary balance sheets you so proudly presented to my analysts. A collective murmur of shock and disgust swept through the surrounding tables. The wealthy investors who had been shaking Richard's hand just an hour ago were now actively pulling out their cell phones, discreetly texting their brokers and legal teams to immediately sever any remaining ties with my father's radioactive firm. You hid over $30 million of bleeding corporate debt, I stated, my voice echoing off the frescoed ceiling. You artificially inflated your quarterly revenue projections by a staggering 40%. You thought you were a financial genius. You thought you were playing high-level chess while everyone else in the industry was playing checkers, but you were just a desperate, sloppy amateur leaving a blazing, undeniable trail of digital evidence for my forensic accountants to meticulously gather, index, and verify. Vanessa let out a choked, ugly sob from behind her mother. She looked at her husband, the man she had proudly flaunted all evening, the man who was supposed to elevate her to the absolute pinnacle of Chicago high society. She was finally comprehending the terrifying reality that her shiny, perfect life was entirely funded by criminal activity. The luxury cars, the designer gowns, the flawed emerald ring she had been showing off so aggressively to anyone who would look, they were all bought with stolen time and fraudulent money. Her golden ticket had just become an anchor that was going to drag her straight to the bottom of the ocean. Did you genuinely believe a multinational conglomerate that moves billions of dollars across global markets would just blindly accept a spreadsheet generated by a junior executive desperate for a promotion? I asked, allowing a sharp note of mockery to enter my voice. We tore your fabricated numbers apart within the first 48 hours of the due diligence period. The rest of the 6 months was simply us letting you dig your own grave. We actively encouraged you. My team asked for more documentation, more specific financial models, and like an eager, obedient dog, you brought us exactly what we needed to secure your absolute destruction. Patricia pressed her hands against her mouth, her eyes wide with a manic, uncomprehending terror. The fragments of her shattered champagne flute lay ignored at her feet. Her entire social empire, built on decades of ruthless snobbery and elitism, was burning to ash right in front of her eyes. She was watching her daughter's husband be exposed as a fraud, and she was entirely powerless to stop it. Dominic's hand remained firmly on the small of my back, an unyielding wall of solid support. He watched my family disintegrate with the casual, detached interest of a man observing a predictable weather pattern. He was letting me wield the blade, allowing me to sever the toxic ties that had held me down for my entire life. But cooking the books for local investors is simply a state-level crime, I said, lowering my voice, just a fraction, forcing the entire room to lean in to hear the final devastating conclusion. That would have just resulted in bankruptcy and a quiet, humiliating resignation. But you got incredibly greedy, Liam. You aimed entirely too high. You desperately wanted the prestige of a massive European buyout to secure your legacy. I locked eyes with him, watching the sheer terror radiate from his trembling frame. You did not just lie to a local bank, I explained, methodically laying out the legal trap he had willingly walked directly into. You engaged in a massive, highly coordinated effort to completely defraud a foreign conglomerate. You passed intentionally falsified financial documents across international borders. Every single email attachment you sent to my team in Europe, every fabricated profit and loss statement you uploaded to our secure servers, constitutes a separate, distinct count of federal wire fraud. Liam let out a low, pathetic moan, his knees finally giving out completely. He slumped heavily into the dining chair behind him, his head falling forward into his hands. He was a man who suddenly realized he was going to lose absolutely everything he had ever valued. You have committed international corporate fraud on a massive scale, I announced, delivering the final fatal blow to his career and his freedom. Every single transmission, every email, every digital signature you provided has been meticulously compiled, notarized, and handed over to a team of international corporate lawyers. We are not just pulling out of this acquisition, Liam. Ethelgard Holdings is actively handing our entire forensic audit directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Department of Justice, and Interpol. By 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, you are looking at decades in federal prison. The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying, and final. I had systematically dismantled their delusions, exposed their crimes, and guaranteed their public and legal ruin. Slowly, the awful reality of the situation fully penetrated Richard's shock. My father, the man who had built this firm from the ground up, the man who had prioritized his company over his own flesh and blood, finally understood the magnitude of the catastrophe. He realized that the golden boy he had chosen to replace me, the man he had groomed and protected and elevated, had not saved his legacy. Liam had completely destroyed it, ensuring that Richard's name would forever be associated with one of the largest corporate fraud scandals in the history of the city. Richard's hands began to shake violently. The sickly ashen gray of his complexion was rapidly replaced by a deep, dangerous shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged against his stiff white collar. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto the trembling, pathetic figure of his chosen successor. All the patrician dignity, all the forced elegance completely evaporated. Richard lunged forward, grabbing Liam by the lapels of his ruined bisque-stained tuxedo. He hauled the younger man half out of his chair, shaking him with a sudden violent burst of adrenaline-fueled fury. "What did you do?" Richard screamed, his voice cracking and echoing wildly through the grand ballroom. "What did you do to my company?" Richard twisted the expensive silk lapels of Liam's ruined tuxedo, his aging knuckles turning completely white with the force of his grip. He shook the younger man with the frantic, uncoordinated strength of a drowning victim, desperately fighting for air. Liam stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping precariously on the spilled ice water and lobster bisque that now coated the pristine marble floor. The two men who had spent the entire evening congratulating themselves on their superior intellect and untouchable status were now reduced to a pathetic physical scuffle in front of Chicago's most elite citizens. "Get your hands off of me!" Liam yelled, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. He shoved his mentor away with a violent thrust to his chest. Richard stumbled back, slamming heavily into the edge of our dining table and sending the remaining silverware clattering sharply against the crystal glasses. Liam was breathing rapidly, his chest heaving as he frantically wiped the sweat from his forehead. He looked around the ballroom, seeing nothing but the cold, judgmental stares of the very investors he had been trying so desperately to impress. The realization that there was absolutely no escape from the legal trap I had meticulously built for him finally broke the last remaining shreds of his carefully manufactured confidence. Like a cornered rat, his instinct for self-preservation overrode every ounce of loyalty he had ever possessed. He immediately turned his vicious, terrified anger directly back onto the man who had groomed him. "Do not dare try to pin this entirely on me, Richard," Liam snarled, pointing an accusatory finger at his father-in-law. "You are the one who demanded a miracle. You sat in my office 6 months ago and explicitly told me that the firm was drowning in toxic debt. You told me the banks were preparing to call in our commercial loans by the end of the quarter. You said we needed to secure the Ethelgard buyout at absolutely any cost, or the entire company was going to be liquidated." "That is an absolute lie," Richard bellowed, his face turning a dangerous, mottled shade of purple. "I never told you to commit federal wire fraud. I never told you to forge digital balance sheets and send them to Europe. You told me to fix the numbers," Liam screamed back, his voice echoing shrilly off the high frescoed ceilings. "You explicitly told me to make the revenue projections look attractive to the European buyers. You knew exactly how bad the firm's true financial standing was. You knew we were carrying $30 million in defaulted construction loans. You just intentionally looked the other way because you were too much of a coward to deal with the reality of your own failure. You wanted plausible deniability, but you were more than happy to reap the rewards of my creative accounting. Do not pretend you are innocent in this. You are going down right alongside me." The sheer volume of their mutual destruction was magnificent to witness. They were actively confessing to gross corporate negligence and conspiracy in a room completely filled with their peers, their competitors, and several prominent members of the city council. Before Richard could launch another verbal assault, a sharp, piercing shriek tore through the heavy air. Vanessa stepped out from behind her mother, her face completely twisted in an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. The smug, vicious triumph that had defined her features all evening was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic panic of a woman watching her entire identity evaporate into thin air. She lunged forward, her expensive high heels clicking erratically against the floorboards. She did not run to her husband to offer comfort or solidarity. She ran to him to inflict pain. Vanessa slammed her fist directly into Liam's chest. "You lied to me!" She shrieked, her voice carrying a grating, hysterical edge that forced several nearby guests to physically wince. "You promised me we were secure. You promised me you were a senior partner making millions of dollars. You told me this European buyout was going to make us the wealthiest family in the city." Liam tried to catch her flailing wrists, but Vanessa was thrashing wildly, completely unconcerned with the public spectacle she was creating. "We are broke," Vanessa wailed, the reality of her impending poverty finally shattering her mind. "You cooked the books. You committed federal fraud. We are going to lose everything: the penthouse, the cars, the club memberships. You are going to prison and you are leaving me with absolutely nothing. You pathetic, useless fraud. You promised me a dynasty and you gave me a criminal record." She ripped her hand out of his grasp and aggressively shoved her left hand directly into his face, displaying the massive, flawed emerald ring she had been showing off so proudly just an hour ago. "Is this even real?" she demanded, her voice breaking into a wretched sob. "Is any of this real, Liam? Or did you buy this with stolen money too?" The wealthy investors seated at the adjacent tables were now actively turning their chairs away from the unfolding disaster. The social contagion of my family's ruin was spreading rapidly. No one wanted to be caught in the blast radius of a federal investigation. Patricia watched the complete disintegration of her carefully curated world with wide, uncomprehending eyes. The fragments of her shattered crystal champagne flute lay entirely ignored at her feet. She looked at her husband, who was clutching the dining table and gasping for breath. She looked at her golden child, Vanessa, who was currently shrieking like a banshee in the middle of a high society gala. She looked at her chosen son-in-law, who was actively admitting to international corporate crimes. Her entire universe, a universe built exclusively on ruthless snobbery, financial elitism, and the subjugation of anyone she deemed inferior, was burning to ash right in front of her. The sheer terror of losing her social standing, of being exiled from the country clubs and charity boards that defined her existence, finally broke through Patricia's shock. Her eyes darted wildly around the room until they finally locked onto me. Suddenly, her entire demeanor shifted. The cruel, condescending matriarch who had spent the evening brutally mocking my appearance, my career, and my supposed spinsterhood completely vanished. In her place was a desperate, terrified woman, grasping at the absolute last straw available to her. Patricia burst into tears. It was a sudden, dramatic display of weeping that lacked any genuine sorrow, fueled entirely by panic and self-preservation. She practically tripped over the hem of her designer gown as she rushed across the space separating us. Dominic's posture instantly shifted. His muscles tensed under his perfectly tailored tuxedo, and he took a smooth, protective half-step forward, his storm-gray eyes locking onto my mother with a lethal, silent warning. He was fully prepared to physically intercept her if she tried to cause me any harm. I reached out and rested my hand lightly against his solid chest, silently signaling that I was entirely capable of handling the woman who had tormented me for my entire life. Patricia did not seem to notice Dominic's terrifying glare. She reached out with trembling, desperate hands and tightly grabbed my forearm. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into the silk fabric of my midnight blue gown. Savannah Patricia sobbed, her voice loud and frantic, entirely stripped of its usual aristocratic polish. "Savannah, you have to stop this. You have to tell him to stop." She looked up at Dominic with wide, pleading eyes, then back to me, her tears completely ruining her expensive makeup. "You cannot let this happen. You cannot let him send your father and your brother-in-law to federal prison. Please, you have the power to fix this. You are his wife. You are the co-founder. You can tell your forensic team to bury the audit. You can tell them to quietly close the file and walk away. I looked down at the hands desperately clutching my arm. The same hands that had pointedly excluded me from family photographs. The same hands that had happily paid for Vanessa's lavish wedding while offering me absolutely nothing but sharp criticism. "We are your family, Savannah," Patricia begged, her voice rising in a frantic crescendo. "We share the same blood. You cannot just stand there and watch us be destroyed. We will lose the house. We will lose the firm. We will lose our entire standing in this city. You are a wealthy, powerful woman now. You do not need to do this. Please, I am begging you. You cannot do this to us." The heavy silence of the ballroom hung on my response. Hundreds of people were holding their breath, waiting to see if the prodigal daughter would finally show mercy to the people who had so brutally cast her aside. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her frantic, desperate energy. I remained perfectly calm, an unyielding pillar of ice in the center of their raging fire. I reached over with my free hand and placed my fingers directly over Patricia's trembling grip. Slowly, deliberately, and with an absolute, unshakable finality, I peeled her fingers off my arm. I pushed her hands away entirely, rejecting her physical touch and her emotional manipulation. "Family does not trade their daughter's future for a country club membership," I said, my voice quiet, smooth, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Family does not actively cheer when one of their own is publicly humiliated. You made your choice 5 years ago, Mom. You proudly chose the man who offered you the illusion of wealth over the daughter who simply wanted your support. You built this cage entirely by yourselves. I am not doing anything to you. I am just enforcing the consequences." Patricia let out a hollow, devastated gasp, stumbling backward as if my words carried a physical, kinetic force. She covered her face with her hands, finally realizing that the bridge she had so gleefully burned 5 years ago could never ever be rebuilt. Behind her, the sound of ragged, heavy breathing drew my attention. Richard was leaning heavily against the table, his knuckles white, his chest heaving as he desperately tried to pull air into his lungs. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide and bloodshot as he watched the absolute collapse of his dynasty. The realization that I was entirely immune to their begging finally snapped the last logical thread in his mind. He pushed himself off the table, swaying unsteadily on his feet. He refused to accept total defeat. He refused to believe that the daughter he considered a failure held the power of life and death over his existence. "You cannot leave us with nothing," Richard yelled, his voice a hoarse, ragged roar that tore through his throat. He pointed a shaking finger at me, his face twisted in a mask of delusional, desperate defiance. "You think you have completely destroyed me, Savannah. You think this audit is the end of the line. But you are wrong. We are not destitute. You cannot leave us with nothing. We still have the family estate to leverage for legal fees." Richard's desperate, furious shout hung in the heavy, perfumed air of the ballroom, a pathetic, grating echo of a patriarch who had just lost his entire kingdom. The sheer volume of his delusion was genuinely staggering. He stood there, his face a dangerous, mottled shade of purple, his chest heaving as he frantically tried to assert dominance over a situation that had completely slipped from his grasp. He actually believed that the physical walls of his ancestral home could somehow shield him from the catastrophic, life-ruining consequences of his own unchecked hubris. He genuinely thought he still possessed a single card left to play. I had already taken 2 steps toward the grand exit, my hand resting securely in the crook of Dominic's arm, but Richard's frantic, grasping declaration brought me to a smooth, deliberate halt. Dominic stopped instantly beside me. He stood as a silent, immovable force of nature, perfectly attuned to my every movement, his powerful presence forming an absolute, impenetrable barrier between me and the toxic wreckage of my family. I did not sigh in frustration. I did not roll my eyes at my father's predictable, desperate posturing. I simply turned back to face them, allowing a slow, razor-sharp smile to curve my lips. The crowd of elite Chicago socialites, who had begun to awkwardly disperse to avoid the immediate blast radius of Richard's impending federal indictment, immediately froze in their tracks. The morbid, insatiable curiosity of the ultra-wealthy is a powerful gravitational pull, and absolutely no one in that grand ballroom wanted to miss the final bloody act of this spectacular corporate execution. I smoothly released my hold on Dominic's arm and reached into the sleek, midnight blue silk clutch I had been carrying all evening. My fingers immediately closed around a single neatly folded piece of heavy cardstock. It was the absolute, undeniable coup de grace. It was the final heavy nail in the coffin of the empire that had aggressively rejected and belittled me for my entire adult life. I pulled the document free, the crisp, sharp sound of the unfolding paper cutting cleanly through the breathless, suffocating silence of the room. You have always possessed a profound, almost magical talent for total denial, Dad, I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, ringing clarity that commanded the absolute attention of every single billionaire politician and rival CEO present. You constantly preach to the press about the sacred, untouchable value of the family legacy, yet you actively treat it like a limitless credit line to unconditionally fund your massive, fragile ego. I held the document up, letting the harsh, bright glare of the crystal chandeliers illuminate the stark black ink and the raised, officially embossed seal of the county clerk's office stamped firmly at the bottom of the page. Richard's bloodshot, panicked eyes zeroed in on the paper. His heavy breathing hitched as he desperately tried to decipher the dense legal jargon from 10 feet away. Patricia stood completely paralyzed beside him, her tear-streaked face a mask of unadulterated, uncomprehending horror. She instantly recognized the thick, textured paper of a formal property deed, and her superficial, status-obsessed mind immediately began to short-circuit with terror. You did not just leverage the firm to fund Liam's fraudulent, reckless expansion, I explained methodically, walking the captivated audience through the exact timeline of his spectacular failure. You secretly leveraged the family estate. You took out a massive, highly aggressive, high-interest collateral loan against the Beacon Hill property 3 years ago to quietly cover the firm's mounting, unsustainable operational deficits. You willingly gambled the very roof over my mother's head because you were entirely too proud to admit to your board of directors that your outdated, archaic business model was rapidly failing. Richard opened his mouth, undoubtedly trying to formulate a lie to spin a defensive face-saving narrative for the listening investors, but absolutely no sound emerged. His vocal cords simply refused to cooperate with his desperate, thrashing mind. He knew I possessed the exact figures. He knew he was completely trapped. And because Liam's wildly inflated revenue projections never actually materialized in the real world, I continued my tone relentless and surgically precise. You could not make the massive balloon payments when they inevitably came due. The firm has been completely insolvent for quarters. You officially defaulted on the estate's collateral loan exactly 2 months ago. Patricia let out a high, thin wail that pierced the quiet room like a siren. It was a sound of pure, primal panic. She turned her wide, terrified eyes toward Richard, her perfectly manicured hands flying up to aggressively grip her own hair, destroying her elegant updo. Defaulted. Patricia shrieked, entirely abandoning any remaining pretense of high society elegance or aristocratic dignity. Richard, what is she talking about? Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not gamble our home. Tell me we are not losing the house. Richard could not even look at his hysterical wife. He kept his horrified, unblinking gaze locked firmly on the document in my hand. His silence was the most damning confession possible. He knew the bank had been issuing aggressive certified warning letters. He knew the legal grace period had entirely expired weeks ago. He had simply been praying that Dominic's massive European buyout would provide the instant miraculous liquidity needed to quietly settle the crippling debt before Patricia or the board ever found out. You thought the bank was just being predictably slow to process the foreclosure paperwork, I said, easily reading the pathetic, transparent, desperate calculations running through his mind. You thought you could stall the bank executives with empty promises of this spectacular Ethelgard acquisition. You genuinely believed you had outsmarted the entire financial system. But the bank was not being slow, Dad. The bank simply no longer owned your debt. I took one final devastating step forward, closing the physical distance between us to ensure he felt the absolute crushing weight of his new reality. Liam, still slumped in his chair like a broken doll, slowly lifted his head, his eyes widening in fresh terror as he realized the true magnitude of the trap they had walked into. My holding company, the very same European hospitality division that you spent the entire evening loudly mocking as a collection of cheap tourist traps, quietly bought your toxic debt directly from the bank, the exact second it went into default, I announced. The words struck my father with the kinetic force of a physical blow. He staggered backward, knocking into the edge of the table. We purchased the entire loan portfolio for absolute pennies on the dollar because your completely ruined firm rendered the paper virtually worthless to traditional lenders, I explained, savoring the absolute destruction of his pride. I own the mortgage, I own the liens, I hold the absolute uncontested legal title to the collateral. The total undeniable truth finally penetrated Patricia's panic-stricken mind. The grand sprawling estate with its manicured lawns, the massive indoor swimming pool, the vast walk-in closets filled with designer labels, the very physical foundation of her entire social identity and arrogant superiority no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the daughter she had aggressively bullied, belittled, and banished. She let out a wretched, guttural sob, her knees buckling slightly as she leaned heavily against Richard's arm for physical support. You no longer own the estate you are currently standing in, I stated, addressing both my parents with a voice entirely devoid of any lingering familial warmth or hesitation. You are formally 90 days behind on your payments. The grace periods have completely expired. There are no more extensions, no more hidden funds, and absolutely no more billionaire saviors coming to bail you out of your profound incompetence. The investors in the room began murmuring rapidly, the sound resembling a swarm of angry bees. They were witnessing the total financial execution of a family that had ruled their social circle for decades. Richard was financially ruined. Liam was heading to federal prison. Patricia was effectively homeless. The absolute totality of my victory was undeniable. I turned my gaze away from my shattered parents and looked directly at Vanessa. My sister-in-law was backed into the corner of the dining table, her face stained with ruined running mascara, her chest heaving with frantic, shallow breaths. She was still aggressively clutching her left hand to her chest, her trembling fingers wrapped tightly around the massive flawed emerald ring she had shoved into my face earlier in the evening to assert her dominance. She was terrified, broken, and entirely stripped of her manufactured superiority. She had married a man destined for decades behind bars, and she was permanently tied to a family that had just been publicly stripped of every single asset, property, and shred of dignity they possessed. She stared at me, waiting for the final blow to fall. I offered her a smile that was perfectly polite, unnervingly calm, and absolutely ruthless. Keep the ring, Vanessa. You're going to need to pawn it for a security deposit. You all have 30 days to vacate my property. I did not wait for Vanessa to formulate a response. There was nothing left for her to say, and absolutely nothing left for me to hear. I turned on my heel, the heavy silk of my gown sweeping gracefully across the ruined marble floor. Dominic was instantly at my side, his hand returning to the small of my back to guide me through the paralyzed crowd. We did not run. We did not rush. We walked with the slow, measured, and entirely unbothered pace of royalty, leaving a particularly dull theater performance. Behind us, the grand ballroom descended into total, unrestrained pandemonium. The facade of high society elegance had been completely obliterated, replaced by a chaotic frenzy of self-preservation. I could hear Richard shouting my name, his voice a hoarse, ragged bark of denial and fury, but his commands carried zero authority. He was a ghost, screaming at the living. I heard the sharp, distinct sound of a slap, followed instantly by Vanessa shrieking at Liam at the top of her lungs, demanding to know where her money had gone. Patricia was wailing uncontrollably, a high-pitched, rhythmic keening that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. Not a single person tried to stop us. As Dominic and I moved toward the grand arched exit, the incredibly wealthy investors, the ruthless corporate raiders, and the elite socialites practically fell over themselves to get out of our way. The sea of tailored tuxedos and designer gowns parted for us in absolute terrified silence. These were people who worshipped power and despised vulnerability. They had just watched me systematically dismantle a Chicago dynasty without breaking a sweat, and they were utterly terrified of catching my attention. I caught the eye of Senator Vance as we passed his table. The man who had been sharing expensive scotch with my father an hour ago was now furiously texting on his phone, his face pale and sweating. When he saw me looking at him, he quickly dropped his gaze to the floor, actively pretending to be fascinated by the pattern of the carpet. He was already severing his ties, already calling his political fixers to erase any public connection to Richard's crumbling empire. The social exile of my family was happening in real time, a brutal, immediate excommunication from the only world they had ever valued. We stepped out of this ballroom and into the long, vaulted corridor that led to the club's grand foyer. The heavy mahogany double doors swung shut behind us, closing with a deep, resonant thud that felt incredibly final. The sound instantly muffled the shrieking, the shouting, and the frantic murmurs of the ruined gala. The sudden quiet of the corridor was absolute bliss. It was the sound of total, undeniable victory. We walked past the imposing oil portraits of past club presidents that lined the corridor. These painted men, with their stern expressions and old money arrogance, used to intimidate me when I was a child. My father used to point to them and lecture me about legacy, demanding that I conform to their archaic standards of what a woman should be. Now I walked past them without a second thought. They were just old paint on decaying canvas. Their rules, their judgments, and their highly conditional love had absolutely no power over me anymore. The club manager, a man who had spent the last 2 decades treating me with barely concealed disdain under Patricia's strict instructions, was standing rigidly near the coat check. He had clearly heard the commotion echoing from the ballroom. As Dominic and I approached, the manager swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He practically lunged forward to retrieve Dominic's tailored cashmere overcoat, offering it with trembling, excessively deferential hands. He bowed his head deeply as we passed, a silent acknowledgement of the new terrifying hierarchy I had just established. Dominic draped his coat over his arm and placed his hand gently on the brass handle of the club's main entrance. He pushed the heavy door open, and we stepped out into the biting, crisp Chicago night. The blast of freezing, unadulterated winter air hit my face, and I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with the sharp, clean oxygen. The toxic, suffocating atmosphere of the country club, heavy with expensive perfume, manufactured laughter, and generations of suffocating familial obligation, was gone. The crisp wind swept over my skin, carrying away the last lingering remnants of the girl who used to crave Richard's approval and fear Patricia's judgment. At the base of the grand stone staircase, a sleek, massive black town car was waiting, its engine purring with a low, powerful hum. The driver, a towering man in a sharp black suit, immediately stepped out and opened the rear door, bowing his head respectfully as we approached. Dominic guided me down the stairs, his grip on my hand warm and grounding against the biting cold. He waited until I was safely seated in the plush leather interior before sliding in beside me. The driver closed the heavy door instantly, sealing us inside a quiet, secure sanctuary of warm air and soft ambient lighting. The car smoothly pulled away from the curb, leaving the imposing, illuminated facade of the country club behind. I did not turn around to look back. I kept my eyes fixed firmly forward, watching the dark, tree-lined streets of my former neighborhood blur past the tinted windows. Dominic shifted in his seat, turning his body toward me. He reached out and gently brushed a stray lock of hair away from my face, his storm-gray eyes studying my expression with intense, focused care. The ruthless, predatory titan of industry who had just terrorized a room full of billionaires had completely vanished. In his place was the man who knew every scar on my soul, the man who had stood by me while I meticulously planned the destruction of my abusers. "Are you okay?" Dominic asked, his voice a low, incredibly gentle rumble in the quiet space of the car. I turned my head to look at him. I searched my own mind, actively probing for any lingering trace of guilt, any phantom sting of regret, or any sudden wave of sorrow for the family I had just publicly annihilated. I searched for the terrified, insecure 20-year-old girl who used to cry herself to sleep in this very city. I found absolutely nothing. The internal landscape of my mind was completely clear, bright, and incredibly quiet. The massive, crushing weight of their expectations, the constant suffocating fear of their disapproval, and the toxic, deeply ingrained belief that I was fundamentally flawed had all been entirely incinerated. I looked past Dominic, staring out the opposite window, as the town car merged onto the highway. In the distance, the sprawling, brilliant skyline of downtown Chicago rose against the dark night sky. The towering skyscrapers, the glittering office buildings, the massive financial institutions, where men like my father and Liam played their corrupt games, looked remarkably small from this distance. It was just a city. It was no longer a prison. A slow, entirely genuine smile broke across my face. It was not the sharp, weaponized smile I had used in the ballroom. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. "I am perfect," I replied, my voice ringing with a profound, unshakable certainty. "I have never been better in my entire life." Dominic let out a soft, warm breath, his own lips curving into a proud, deeply affectionate smile. He reached down and laced his strong fingers securely through mine, resting our joined hands on his thigh. He did not ask any more questions. He understood exactly what I was feeling. He knew that the ghost of my past had finally been laid to rest, buried under a mountain of federal indictments and foreclosure notices. The town car accelerated, gliding smoothly down the empty interstate. We were not heading back to a luxury hotel in the city center. We were not staying in Chicago for a single second longer than necessary. We were heading directly to O'Hare International Airport, where our private jet was currently sitting on the tarmac, fully fueled and prepped for an immediate transatlantic departure. I leaned my head against the soft leather headrest and watched the city lights streak past the glass like falling stars. Tomorrow morning, Richard would wake up to the terrifying reality of federal agents knocking on the heavy oak doors of an estate he no longer owned. Tomorrow morning, Liam would begin his frantic, pathetic scramble to hire defense attorneys with money he no longer possessed. Tomorrow morning, Patricia and Vanessa would finally have to face the brutal, unforgiving reality of a world that did not care about their country club status or their borrowed designer names. But tomorrow morning I would wake up in Europe. I would wake up in the massive, sunlit bedroom of my own home, lying next to a man who loved me for exactly who I was, not for what I could provide for his social climbing agenda. I would walk into the glass-walled headquarters of a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that I had built from the ground up using my own brilliance, my own relentless drive, and my own unbroken spirit. I was returning to my true family. I was returning to a vast international empire that operated on genuine merit, fierce loyalty, and absolute transparency. I had walked into the darkest, most toxic chapter of my past, and I had burned it completely to the ground. I had taken the ashes of their arrogance and scattered them to the wind. I tightened my grip on Dominic's hand, feeling the solid, undeniable reality of the life we had forged together. The plane was waiting. The sky was clear. The entire world was open, bright, and completely mine. I closed my eyes, letting the smooth rhythm of the car carry me forward into the beautiful, incredibly authentic life I had fought so fiercely to create, leaving the ruins of Chicago far behind in the rearview mirror.